Okay, good morning councillors, good morning officers. Welcome to this session of the Economy and Development Select Committee. Can I welcome obviously those colleagues who are not normally on this committee. You're very, very welcome. And can I also welcome the Cabinet Member for Finance, Councillor Phil Murphy. Thank you for attending this morning. Before we go into the agenda as is, can we just do a brief introduction so those who are watching around the world know who we are. I'm Councillor Paul Pavia and I'm Chair of this committee.
Hazel Eilert, Scrutiny.
Richard Williams, Democratic Services.
Mark Howcroft, Acting Head of Finance.
Peter Davis, Chief Officer for Resources.
Jeremy Becker, Committee Member.
Matt Feekins, Committee Member.
Kelly Byrne, Enterprise.
Kath Fallon, Enterprise and Community Development.
Debbie Blakeborough, Vice Chair of this committee.
Councillor David Davey, Committee Member.
Alan Davis, Committee Member.
Val Smith, Observing.
Thank you very much, everyone. So first item on the agenda is apologies for absence. Do you have any apologies, Richard?
Just one apology, Chair, from Councillor Strong.
Thank you very much. Item number 2, declarations of interest. Are items on the agenda? Anyone at this stage? If we do get to a point where you are made aware, obviously do indicate it and you have the relevant forms in front of you. Item 3, to confirm the minutes of 3.1 of the Economy and Development Select Committee on the 19th of October 2017. Is everyone happy with those minutes? Move. Yeah. Anyone to second that? Yeah. Okay. All agreed? Thank you. 3.2, then the special meeting of the Economy and Development Select Committee on the 26th of October 2017. Everyone happy with them?
Move.
Yeah, thanks Councillor Davis. Seconder for that? Thank you. All in favour? Thank you. Item number 4, public open forum. Does anyone indicate they want to speak this morning? No, there's no one here. Okay, thank you very much. So item number 5, the medium-term financial plan 2018-19 to 21-22. The draft budget proposals 2018-19 for consultation. I'm going to hand over to Mark. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pretty exacting report that goes through explaining the assumptions that we make in driving the medium-term financial plan. It builds upon the report that the Cabinet would have seen on the 22nd in terms of all the proposals, and each select will get a stylised report that basically chunks up the pressures and the savings proposed for their area of the portfolio. So actually you'll see across all 4 selects, whilst the report will be slightly different in individual items and pro formas, the actual approach is very much the same. So it tries to give members an overall context around the budget in terms of what we're presuming around inflation, pay awards. It gives them a thorough understanding of the Welsh Government settlement from a revenue support grant purposes. It acknowledged that actually some of the grants, some of the more significant grants that we're due and rely on, we still don't know yet. That's not necessarily uncommon for the budget process, but nevertheless, neither is it ideal because it introduces a volatility to the process that we would like to run a bit smoother. What I should probably do first off is just explain the general assumptions for next year. So you can see the recommendations presented to Cabinet on the 22nd of November, as a result of which there were 4 changes that Cabinet required in its consultation with selects. One was to increase the council tax increase for next year from a standard 3.95% to 4.95% on a 1-year basis. There were 2 savings proposals that don't affect this select committee, but they would have liked removed from the proposals. One was around charging for breakfast clubs, which now won't appear at the CYP Select Committee, and one was charging blue badge holders for car parking. And the fourth aspect was they would like, in the capital programme, last year they provided a one-off 300,000 to help with the backlog of DFGs. They would like to continue that on a one-year basis into 18-19. So those are the four volatilities as a result of the 22nd, and all the revised reports reflect that. So if I refer you to paragraph 311, which is the inflation indicators. Our medium-term financial plan attempts to model the budget on a 4-year basis. For the last couple of years, we've actually focused on settling a 1-year budget. That's the council requirement. It doesn't actually have to set a 4-year budget. This is purely for planning purposes. And what we look to do is actually look at the existing budget in the current year. We incrementally apply inflation factors, and we look at pressures and savings, and as a result of which the control totals for each department is adjusted. So you can see there for external income, discretionary fees and charges, we already presume as a standard within the MTFP 2.5% increase as a result of inflation. The choice to levy that is down to individual service managers because they're closer to understanding the demand aspect and the elasticity of price. And where they don't, that effectively is a hidden cut to them. Some of them, conversely, in their savings proposals, advocate an inflation-busting increase. So perhaps a 5% increase rather than the standard 2.5%, and it's the 2.5% that's captured in the savings proposal because the MTFP already presumes that 2.5% as a standard. Pay inflation for the last couple of years has been static at 1%. We anticipate it will stay static, although there has been a lot of murmurings around releasing the public sector pay cap. We don't have any insider knowledge to know whether that will be the reality or not. But to give you an indication, if that 1% moved from 1%, for every 1% consideration, it's about £400,000 or £500,000 worth of change. We don't presume anything for non-pay inflation. That's quite a simple assumption because you can appreciate that maybe one or two of our contracts actually have RPI or CPI increases built into them, and service managers are expected to manage that over and above any savings presumptions that they bring forward. So probably one of the refinements that we will make to the MTFP in future years is perhaps to split those lines so that we can apply a differential inflation factor for the two. But there's always work to do to refine your financial planning assumptions, and that would probably be one that I would look to do. We have a standard vacancy factor of 2% historically built into the budget, so there's a presumption that where there are any vacancies in sections that it obviously takes a little while to fill those roles, and therefore there is a simple 2% vacancy assumption. I suspect that probably in the future we'll also need to review that, because it strikes me that if there are less and less people working here annually, that actually there is a need more to fill those in a back-to-back fashion, and probably that vacancy assumption isn't likely to be the reality. It also presumes that there will be a degree of churn in the organisation that is kind of decreasing. Superannuation, there's a 1% increase across the 4 years. It starts at 22.1 for next year and goes up by 1% thereafter. That's as a result of actuarial reviews that we've had from the Greater Gwent Pension Fund in terms of what our employer rates should be set at for the next 4 years. And as a planning assumption for the last 3 years, we've presumed a cash flatline position. So we haven't expected schools to make savings similar to other service departments, but we have conversely expected them to be able to afford their pay awards for teachers and non-teaching staff within schools. The reserve position, our general reserve, the council fund reserve, is still within our financial planning envelope of between 4 and 6% of net expenditure. When you hear me talk about reservations about reserves, it's more so around the earmarked levels. Those are the reserves that the council has explicitly decided to put aside for a particular purpose. The level of those reserves in some of the reserves which would normally be the ones that would be drawn upon for significant re-engineering, whether it be things like the redundancy reserve, IT reserve, priority investment or investor redesign, are at a fairly low ebb. And there's nothing allowed in the budget for active replenishment. Every year what we do is we look at the year-end balance, and it's a decision or a recommendation of the head of finance to Cabinet and the executive as to which ones we will replace. And members might remember at the end of last year we had an £800,000 surplus, and we chose to recommend investor redesign, IT reserve and the redundancy reserve as being the flavour of the reserves that are most likely to have activity on them. Capital financing, other than DFGs, we have a separate capital finance report that goes through the projects. There is a revenue dimension to that, in that we have to judge what proportion of those projects will be borne by borrowing, and obviously the repayment of borrowing is a revenue cost, which is why you see it in the revenue report as well as a distinct capital report. It'd be fair to say that our focus for the next couple of years remains largely the completion of our Tranche A future schools. That is a significant item within the capital programme. There is recognition that actually there is a Tranche B scheme proposed by Welsh Government, and we have some designs on what we might like to do for that, but there's nothing actually being plotted into the next 4 years capital programme until we actually understand the consequences of that in a better fashion. That's not problematic, because you'll appreciate as members that council get to see capital reports through the year when there's a need to add things into the capital programme and how they're financed, and that would probably, if that decision crystallises outside of the normal budget setting round, that would probably be the way that that report is brought back to council. The other thing that is potentially not known to us is that things like corporate costs includes precepts and levies, which are reported to us through the budget process. We don't actively, when we start in October, know what some of those figures are. So there's a number of dimensions to the budget that is iterative in nature, both the pressures and savings and your consideration of them through that budget process, resulting in a sign-off in February. But also that some of those pressures manifest themselves between the October and the January position that will require potentially additional savings, or will provide a saving whereby the budget next year needs to be less than has been in the past. So you can see we started the process with on a 4-year basis, a £40 million shortfall between looking at what budget we had and what savings we had to make. Some of that has changed because things like our settlement for next year, whilst it's less than we would like and is still on a declining basis, it's actually more than we'd presumed that decrease would be, which provides a slight benefit to our planning assumptions. And when you look at the level of pressures, when you look at the RSG settlement and work through what we think for grants and the savings, we've got to a position whereby we're about £250,000 adrift from where we need to be in terms of setting a balanced budget. None of that decries your consideration around some of those savings and pressures. And obviously the one thing I am fully aware of is that that bottom line will change before it becomes balanced. For those new members that might be going through their first budget cycle, it's actually council that agrees the budget in February time. What we tend to do is document the feedback that we've had from the 4 selects, and that forms part of the budget report. But you do perhaps have other mechanisms whereby you can either go back to the individual cabinet member. If you have any queries, you can always feed them back through myself, and I'm sure Councillor Murphy, as executive member for finance, is always very interested in any new proposals, particularly that allow us to set a balanced budget. I mean, you always make a plea, Councillor Murphy, about a good idea is generally a good idea, and if anyone would wish to volunteer anything to the budget process, now is the time to do so. So probably
if I could just interject there, Chair, particularly because it came up in Cabinet last week when it was suggested by the leader of the Labour group that we pinch his ideas, put that in context. Absolutely. If they've got legs, we'll use them. If they come after the 31st of January, we cannot use them, not in that year. It doesn't mean that we won't continue to evaluate them and incorporate them in future years. And there's lots of examples of that. But if I really need to reiterate, and the report says it, if anybody has something that they want us to consider, they must tell us by the 31st of January, otherwise it will not be included in this year's budget. Might be in subsequent, but not this year.
So if I just go on to explain some of the appendices, Appendix 1 explains the current grant position that we know about. There are some fairly significant grants in there that we rely on that we're still not aware of in terms of what the final funding will be, and it's unlikely that we will know that until, well, probably just short of the Christmas break.
When I keep reading NA, does that mean you don't know?
Yes.
Right, that's fine. It's not applicable.
Yeah, in the glossary at the bottom, NA says equals figures not available at the time of publication. Right, so NA is not available as a rather not applicable. Yeah, I beg your pardon. So the biggest one that I'm particularly interested in is our post-16 funding, which obviously has an impact on schools, particularly in light of some of the EIG funding, the improvement grant funding for schools actually also being on the declining basis. But as soon as I get that information, I'll be modelling the consequences and letting members know through the process. Appendix B talks about the RSG levels. The way that RSG works is that Welsh Government will give a provisional settlement round about October on which to work your figures out. Undertakes a period of consultation on the budget, of which our response to it is in Appendix 3 in terms of our response back to them. They will obviously get responses from the other 21 authorities in Wales. And then I think it's the 15th of December, they will give a final budget figure, which, if I'm honest with you, doesn't often change from their provisional settlement, although last year we did benefit from a rurality adjustment in putting an argument together that us and other semi-rural authorities were adversely affected by the funding formula. Whether that will prove to be the same this year remains to be seen, I think. Appendix 4 and 5 are commonly where the new pressures and new savings into the budget are identified. You can see there are, I think it's 3 pressures for economy and development area. And what I've tried to do is also include the background to them in terms of either what the service manager has told us or remind members where it's already been subject to a separate report rather than have you try to find that. So I think the first one there is related to the Monmouth Leisure Centre rebuild, a recognition that if it's going to be out of action, its income targets for next year are going to be affected. The second one, we knew this time last year that actually the private leasing scheme was going to, the management fee was going to be withdrawn by DWP. Colleagues in Enterprise are working quite hard to reduce the consequent pressure on the council. The figure I've left in there is the ultimate pressure that we anticipated at the time that was known to us. I think that very well will move through the process, and not to put words in your mouth, Kelly, my last indication was that you thought it to be more of the order of about 200,000. So that's quite a good news story in terms of indicating to you how they're actually looking to change the way of working to try to manage some of these pressures. It is quite acute in Monmouthshire in that we don't have the extent of private rented properties that other councils would do. We rely quite heavily on that as an initiative. And it's a bit unfortunate that when they decided to close the scheme, actually the way that Welsh Government acted was that they passported it all out to all 22 authorities on a pro rata basis, but not a pro rata basis of how much those authorities relied on those schemes. So actually we've suffered financially from this, and other authorities that don't need to use private leasing have actually benefited in terms of getting a windfall from that arrangement. So, and then the third one is simply a pressure for this year that isn't, a savings proposal for this year that is unlikely to manifest itself to the level that we'd estimated and communicated to members as part of last year's budget process. And you'll see that in the month 7 report that will be going to Cabinet in January. On the savings side of it, what we acknowledge here is that, the future Monmouthshire dimension is likely to introduce some cross-cutting saving measures to the council that actually Enterprise, and through Kelly as the Deputy Chief Exec, will take responsibility for delivering upon. You can appreciate that some of that work and that transitional work is quite involved. So actually at the start of the process, which this report reflects, i.e. October, we don't have cost certainty as to what some of those things will deliver. Those will incrementally become clearer through the budget process, and probably when you get through to January and February time, there'll be a far better expectation of what can be delivered. But that's actually a good news story in terms of if we're only £250 million adrift and we haven't presumed any of that cross-cutting aspect at the moment, that gives us a potential opportunity and is useful to us. So, and then Appendix 6 is a copy of the Future Generations Assessment. We've done this slightly differently than we have in previous years, whereby we've, in past years, done a Future Generation for individual savings. I think the weakness with that is it's encouraged members to actually look at these things as very much individual and isolated examples as to whether they like or dislike a particular saving. And actually what I think I described not long after the new administration is that we need to get better as officers in explaining some of the sophistications that certain savings presumptions allow other things to be sustained or carried on at the same level. So whilst it seems strange for an accountant to suggest that the budget is an artificial construct, the reality is that a lot of these things are actually interrelated, such that you have to do an assessment really on the overall effect to the council. So hopefully that gives you a run through the report, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have, as I'm sure colleagues in the services are able to do as well.
Can I thank the Acting Chief Officer for that narrative to the report? Before we go into questions, just to sort of focus members' attention, if the questions are of a technical nature around the report, the Acting Chief Officer and the other Chief Officers and Heads of Service will deal with that. We've got Councillor Murphy here as well, who will deal with the strategic and policy side of things. So just to focus your minds on how you're going to ask those questions and frame those questions. And in terms of going round, I know that there'll be a lot of questions on this report. Can I propose that we have a question and 2 supplementaries from each member, go around and then come around again, if that's okay. So just so everyone gets a bite of the cherry. Okay? Yep, okay. Councillor Blakeborough.
Thanks, Chair. I suppose it's just getting really clear in my mind, because ultimately every year the settlement in real terms is going downhill, the curve's going down. At the same time as needs and expectations are on the increase. So we know that. So our kind of safety nets, if you like, tend to be our borrowing allowance and our reserves. So can I just clarify again? So by the end of this financial year, our reserves will be 6.2 million?
Those are the earmarked reserves, the ones that the council has the ability to utilise to help with the re-engineering proposals. But the reality is that some of those reserves are quite specific in nature. So things like insurance provision for known claims, you wouldn't automatically use those for re-engineering of services because prudently you're keeping those for a specific purpose.
Yeah.
So I think I actually quoted in the report that the figure is more of the order of about £2 million.
Yeah, right, 2 million reserves. So we've got 2 million reserves. And then our borrowing allowance, have we got a ceiling as to how much we can borrow? Something like 130 million, and actually we're nearly over 100 million borrowed now.
Yeah, the ceiling is something called the capital financing requirement. I'm smiling because I see a number of faces from the audit committee here that recently got their training on the matter. We can borrow what that figure is the amount of the historic capital programme that has been afforded by borrowing. But actually, you're right in saying that actually we've only borrowed 100 million. So members might think, well, does that mean that we've got £30 million worth of borrowing that we haven't utilised? And if so, how does that reconcile? We actually use a system called internal borrowing to avoid taking out extra loans that we don't need to do. So we do our treasury management on what's known as a cash flow consideration. So if we get cash in terms of quarterly grants, etc., if we get 10 instalments of council tax in, that we may very well be in a cash-rich position, and we actually look at whether we can utilise that on a short-term basis to avoid borrowing. It's a bit like you would do your household income. You would look to say, well, if I've got this income coming in, can I use it for something else, even though longer term I'm going to use it for a particular purpose. So we don't use our reserve position to balance our bottom line. We've been very prudent in the past, and that remains one of our key tenets. Neither do we borrow simply to satisfy the revenue budget. The only purpose of borrowing is to afford capital expenditure, which council agrees annually.
And obviously the capital expenditure, sometimes it's the investor save bit. I guess I'm just looking at the picture that every year our money is going down. We've got 2 million in reserves, so that is running dry, that reserve. And then when you're looking at how much we can borrow, ultimately we've only got about 30,000 that we can borrow. Obviously, we don't want to borrow too much because you're just passing on the debt to future generations. It's just looking very dark, I think.
Well, we wouldn't borrow to satisfy the budget consideration. The financial environment affecting public sector and local authorities in Wales is a declining one. I look enviously at some of those that derive a better settlement than we do, but actually, in reporting the financial position to members periodically, you may recall some of the unit costings that I've done. I mean, we've got to ourselves to a position that a lot of our services are very economic when you compare it to our counterparts across Wales. That's a little bit of a double-edged sword, and it should give members a confidence that some of the proposals being brought forward by service managers are right and appropriate, but it does mean that there's not a great deal of fat or spare to absorb some of the pressures. How we've done that to avoid effects on the frontline services is that you may recall things like the MRP consideration and review that we did that meant that actually we avoided passing on last year and the year before the effect of £3 million worth of savings to frontline services. I'm quite pleased to work in Monmouthshire that actually their approach to the budget setting isn't necessarily a slash and burn approach to it that might be common elsewhere, but it does make it quite challenging for officers to see how we might deliver these services in a new way. And I think we're starting to get to the stage where actually you're unable to tinker around the margins and have an effect. And that's why I talk about there being it's important that members understand that reserves will not allow for a great deal of re-engineering, because I do think there will need to be a radical consideration of how some services are provided over this next medium term.
I think Councillor Murphy just wanted to come in there and just to add something to that.
Yes, just briefly, thanks, Chair. I'm not quite sure whether you quite got a handle on the reserves. I think Mark might need to. I haven't got the figure in front of me, but the general reserve is about 7.2 million from memory. You said 2, and I just wondered if you were looking at but I think there's 2 million in. No. That's my point. You're mixing up the general reserve and specific earmarked reserves. So a bit of clarity around that, Mark, might help.
Thank you, Councillor Murphy. The general reserve is made up of the council fund reserve and school balances, and that is, as Councillor Murphy says, of the order of £7 million. That's the one that we set our financial planning assumptions against in terms of being 4 to 6% of net expenditure. That's what the council has got if situations go awry. That's prudently what it's put aside to actually assist with those arrangements. In addition to that, the council makes contributions to specific or earmarked reserves for particular purposes. I don't look at the general reserve when I look at re-engineering services, because you shouldn't really touch that in balancing your budget.
I understand that. I understand that. Where I'm thinking,
Okay. Next questions? Councillor Davis.
I'd like to move back to the revenue support grant if I can, because I constantly hear this reference to it's unfair and rurality and things like that. And I must confess, I've done quite a bit of research and I still don't understand it. And I'm told Peter's the man to talk to, so I'll do that at some time. But what I'd like to ask, we're constantly, everybody's telling us that it's an unfair system. It doesn't compensate for the rurality, and that there's several other counties that are also in that position. So what specific proposals as an authority or as a group of authorities have those rural bodies put forward in order to, as a principle, to change the way that this revenue support grant is calculated? Because if it's inherently unfair, and I've yet to be convinced of that because I haven't seen the evidence, then what have we proposed as an authority as a specific change for it? Because any change you make is going to affect the size of the slices of the cake, and therefore if we get a bigger slice, somebody else is going to get a smaller slice. So what I'm asking really, it's all very well to complain that it's not a fair system, but what are we proposing in its place?
I can give you a personal perspective on some of that as to why I think it's inherently unfair. I think Peter would also like to. Would you like to go first? And I'll.
You can go first, but I'll have my 2 pence, Chair.
Right. The distribution mechanism around the settlement is very complicated and complex. Bear in mind, I guess if I roll back the years a bit in terms of when I sat, in sort of, Mark's position, working closely with Welsh Government, trying to unpick it. It's very difficult to get right down to the bottom of it all. But what we do, there is a distribution subgroup which Joy Robson sits on, our head of finance, and I guess together with the other 22 authorities, they look to work with Welsh Government, with the WLGA, to try and affect the distribution mechanism that for the settlement that the Assembly has to remedy some of these issues. Now, I know, and I'm sure Phil will talk about some of the lobbying that's been put in by ourselves and some of the other rural authorities. Rurality is one issue. The other matter that is picked up repeatedly is around deprivation and the way that Welsh Government assess deprivation. Now, in terms of the amount of funding that we get with regards to deprivation, I think it's probably still in the order of a matter of a few £100. I think when I left my post a few years back, it was in the order of about £300-400. Now, I don't think that's representative and reflective of deprivation. If you reflect on, for example, Abergavenny and parts of Abergavenny, clearly, that there are pockets of deprivation there. We don't see the funding come through in that way. So I'm sure Phil, from a political lens, Phil will offer comment. But at an officer level, we work through the distribution subgroup and try and look to make our case through that channel. But I think, as Mark's talked about yourself, if we adjust the formula to the advantage of some, it's to the disadvantage of others. So it's always a difficult piece of negotiation.
Councillor Murphy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And unfortunately, there is a political side to this, and I'll try and answer it without getting too political, if that's not the contradiction. The distribution subgroup looks at this. So do the leaders when they meet. Lots of representations by AMs and MPs and everything as well, not just ours, but everybody else's. Deprivation is a major factor. If you go back not that long ago, it wasn't as much as the giddy heights of £300 or £400. And when I joined the authority in 2004, it was £10 for the whole of Monmouthshire to deal with deprivation. And the way that the system is skewed, I suppose the crude way of putting it is, the more useless you are at dealing with deprivation, the more money they give you to be useless with. And that, unfortunately, is the reality. Lots of the rural authorities have been making representations, and there was, as Mark mentioned earlier, a little bit of money coming through a couple of years ago, the Rural Stabilisation Grant, I think it was called, and it would be lovely to think we'd get that again. Actually, that was odd, because we were always told that the formula couldn't be altered. And the way that the formula in theory has to be altered is that all authorities have to vote to change it. And again, I try not to be too political here, but our colleagues in the areas with the greatest deprivation are unlikely to give it to us, and they don't. We lose out on that vote every time. Welsh Government have really got a problem with this. They've looked at it an awful lot, and they know it's wrong, but at the moment they can't do anything about it.
Yeah, just one further comment. I'm not sure whether Mark wants to just add one further point himself, but in the papers that you've got today, you will see at Appendix 3 a response to Welsh Government on the provisional settlement, and included within that letter is specifically I think the point that you're raising and making it known, and again further representation back into Welsh Government with regards to issues around us being given an appropriate slice of the cake, where matters of rurality come into play.
Thank you for that. I mean, I'd just like to say, I'm talking personally now, not as a representative of any political party, because I don't talk politics in these meetings. But from my perspective, there seems to be this sense that there is no deprivation in Monmouthshire, and I've had this debate with our local AM, and there is quite a lot of deprivation. And from my perspective, if there is something inherently wrong with the system or unfair, and obviously I'm new, so I don't know the detail that you know, then in my opinion it would be the duty of everybody on this council, regardless of their political aspirations or what side they're supporting, to support change. Because at the end of the day, even though we have one administration at the moment, in the future we may have a different administration who will also have exactly the same problems. So, it's not my job to defend the Welsh Government, and I suspect it's not the job of other people here to do that. If something is inherently unfair, then I think we should all be pushing to change that, regardless of our political persuasion.
Yeah, if I could just add a few comments to those really important points. I think we are where we are at the moment, and obviously the funding formula has been applied in a certain way over a period of time, but post-Brexit, everything is going to change. That money that is allocated to local authorities for deprivation largely comes from European funding. That funding will not be there in the future. In my world, in terms of innovation and the economy, the stuff that Kath and I deal with, the majority of the investment and the funds that flows to local authorities comes from Europe. That money will not be there. So we've got to get ourselves out of this mindset of relying on RSG and money that Welsh Government allocates to us. And I think Councillor Blakeborough raised some really important points. But even though there will be new money in the future, it will be allocated in different ways. We won't just be able to expect money for deprivation. We're going to have to be much more competitive. We're going to have to learn to be innovative. And I don't agree that it is an absolute disaster that our RSG is declining all of the time. I think, that adversity is a real opportunity to think differently. It's not just about the funding settlements that we get from Welsh Government. We've got to get our heads out of that. We've got to think about the other assets, ideas, skills, resources that exist in our communities. The very reason why we don't get allocated a sum of money for deprivation is because we do have high social capital in Monmouthshire. And the conversation needs to be about how we mobilise and unlock some of that. So one example is, just last week, we had a big challenge session in Abergavenny with community partners, business, around how we solve big problems around the future of rural transport. Some of the fantastic solutions that came forward did not rely on a penny of the council's money. And that is the mindset that we absolutely have to get into for the future.
Come back, Mark.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with any of those perspectives that are provided. I mean, Councillor, I think you asked me, well, why do I think it's inherently unfair? Working for Monmouthshire, I'm always going to advocate for Monmouthshire. If I look at the RSG, which provides about a half of our core funding going forward, it is a significant sum of money. When you equate the amount that Monmouthshire gets per head of population against other authorities, it is 22 out of 22 authorities. And actually, working for a rural authority that is rather small, some of the responsibilities on this council are no different than a big council, yet the resources going into it are less. So for instance, our statement of accounts, whilst they might be smaller in pounds, shillings and pence, are no less complicated to put together. In fact, actually, in being smaller, there's a need to be more innovative in producing some of that stuff. The democratic services aspect, it's pretty similar for every authority in Wales, and yet the central government fund is different. Those are the aspects of inequality that I see in terms of funding. I do acknowledge that Welsh Government and other councils regard Monmouthshire as quite affluent, and as a result of which the expectation is it relies more heavily on discretionary fees and charges and council tax. But I just counterpart social care for you. I mean, we have quite an elderly population in Monmouthshire that is perhaps disproportionate to other councils. One of the responses that Welsh Government had this year was to actually increase the affordability limits before anyone would pay their social care fees. That puts additional pressure and actually disproportionate pressure on the likes of Monmouthshire because of its situations. And that's where I view things are unfair. I have an interesting perspective because I live in Cardiff and I see the developments going on in Cardiff, and I work for Monmouthshire. Monmouthshire has to subsidise bus routes, rural bus routes, because they're uneconomic. Cardiff perhaps benefits from actually a transport network and infrastructure that actually it doesn't have to afford. It's being done on a private and commercial basis. So in a rural authority, you do tend to have to support the economy, support the community in a fashion that I don't think is necessarily the same in a big metropolis. But it's only a personal viewpoint, and other people might not necessarily share that.
Okay, Councillor Oden. Do you want to take that, Councillor Murphy? Yeah.
We do make constant representations.
Councillor Murphy, sorry. Councillor, can you turn your microphone off? Sorry, thank you.
Peter Fox is on various committees down there where he's always putting it through. The WLGA are constantly making representations on our behalf, as our AM and MP, together with the work that officers do in the distribution subgroup. We are plugging away at this all the time. That Appendix 3 there is a letter which is always the response that we put in. We will very shortly be putting another one in that's a bit stronger on capital. But as I say, it is a constant battle. There is no simple answer to this. As I said earlier, it's all due to a formula that everybody recognises is wrong, but nobody has the not the ability to change it, but it's almost that. The legislation necessary, the fact that the funding is dished out through the Barnett formula, that there are so many things that would have to change to enable it to change, that we need to learn to live and have done for a long, long time. This is why throughout Wales we're regarded as one of the most innovative authorities. We have to be, because of that low funding. If you look at the difference between us and, say, Blaen y Gwent, which is the highest funded, there's over £500 difference between us. We get about 2/3 of their money. If you want to multiply that over our population, that's more or less 55 million quid. If we had the difference, we are the same as our nearest funded authority. We'd have about another 8 million quid. The Welsh average around 30. So we have to, and this is picking up on Kelly's point, you can almost forget the fact that it isn't fair. We get what we get, and we need to live with it. And if that means that we've got to operate on a skeleton staff to keep everything going, that's regrettably, because it puts tremendous strain on our colleagues, but regrettably the way we have to do it.
Okay, you happy with that? Yep.
Quite frankly, if we had a Labour administration here, I don't think it would make the slightest bit of difference. It's got nothing to do with that.
And I think it comes back to that sort of circular challenge that Councillor Murphy indicated earlier. The Welsh Government see the funding formula as being the property of local government. When they're challenged, this is inherently wrong or unfair. Welsh Government say, well, this is the funding formula that's worked through within the subgroup, and this is what's offered to us to sign off. So it's that challenge, at that level, I think it's important. I've got a question on the budget assumptions 3.7. It says that and just our narrative of being an innovative council and being cost efficient, etc. Process involving comparing MCC unit costs and performance with those of other Welsh councils to understand the greatest opportunity to make further savings. So it's understanding that benchmarking. How do we do that? Who do we do that with? Who are our do we compare ourselves to our rural other rural authorities, or I'd just be interested just to understand that.
We We have to provide certain returns on the same basis of other Welsh authorities. They're known as the RO and RA forms, which are basically the budgeted position for your council and the actual outturn positions. Why we have to use that information is that there is some discipline and skeleton around it as to what to include and what not to include. It's very easy when you start to compare between councils anecdotally that people's costs are influenced by the priorities of that particular council and the way that they choose to do business. So this is perhaps the most objective way that we can go about it. But even then, it's not without its weaknesses. So in a lot of cases, in putting unit costing together, we try to provide a denominator that is reasonable, but sometimes the only one that you can get at is maybe the number of people of the electorate. So it's not an exact science. We did do the exercise again earlier this year that actually indicated that our unit costings were in the lowest quartile in terms of cost. But actually, we also recognise that if we wanted to change some of those, that actually there's a potential on performance. So colleagues in performance, colleagues to Future Monmouthshire, also look at the actual performance within those organisations, looking at key measures. So for instance, if I use education as perhaps one of the more straightforward ones, they would look at the results at particular key stages and say, well, if our unit costs going into a primary school or a secondary school is X, and our results are Y, if we make things more efficient or look to move towards a more economic provision, as one of the other councils would be, what is the likely effect going to be on our performance? To be able to volunteer to members, A, what the likely consequence of that is, and B, to actually get an understanding from members as to whether that would be acceptable. The interesting dimension for me is that we found very little correlation between the amount of resources going into something and the outputs. I would have expected a far more close synergy to that arrangement. So if, for instance, I look at schools, whilst the amounts have to be adequate, there doesn't seem to be a strong relationship between a pound for pound investment in schools and achievement in results. Actually, what you tend to find, it's more about the environment that the head teacher provides, the quality and the drive of the staff involved, and the culture that they set up with children, that they can do anything that they set their mind to, rather than necessarily backing it by money. So that's an interesting perspective when you get a school that you would like to improve their performance, because actually what it might suggest going forward is that you actually apply more of an executive headship approach to it, that actually you link a failing school with one that has a good culture, one that you particularly want to endorse and support, rather than necessarily perhaps pumping money behind that school to improve position. But it was quite a sophisticated piece of work, but even then it wasn't without its doubters that actually some of the activity measures that we look to utilise were regarded as a little simplistic. And actually probably in doing some challenge panels over the summer, the common thread of that from service managers is we're working at a national level to improve our benchmarking. So whilst we haven't stopped that, we've simply parked it and paused it, because it's important that when we take it forward with their engagement and ownership. Or otherwise, it seems to be just forced upon them. And actually, my experience in the past is that those are the ones that don't tend to result in the change that we're looking to deliver. I don't know whether you would like to give a perspective from Future Monmouthshire, Kelly, at all, or whether I covered it. Yeah.
Okay, so, and just to follow on that, you've probably just touched on that, Mark, in terms of the benchmarking data and the quality. Are you saying that we're missing some data, or we're not quite getting the right data to benchmark? Or is it, as you said, some data might be a bit simplistic, but it's just that?
Some is, and as a result of which there is always an argument whether actually the outcome that's drawn from it is too simplistic. I think you could spend forever and a day getting sophisticated information and never making a decision on it. So I think there comes to be a point where you actually have to take quite a pragmatic view with it, but appreciating that data-driven decisions is ultimately where SLT and Cabinet want to get to with it, and this is the first year that we've tried it. I think probably it will be more robust next year as a consequence of some of the ownership of services and understanding this is the direction of travel.
Okay, thank you very much. Who else? Councillor Dovey.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to go back, if I could, just briefly to a part of what Kelly said earlier on about the post-Brexit situation. I think she is absolutely right that we will have to be more innovative, that is for sure. The thing that concerns me is that innovation is, if you like, split into two areas within the council. And the one area, which is, if you like, the finance, our bookkeeping, that, and the way we handle our staff and we are very innovative at that. There is no doubt about that. But there is the other area where we aspire to be innovative, and that is where, if you like, where we're trying to create earnings. And we have been attempting that for some time. I think, bearing in mind how important this could be, I think we have to be better at scrutinising the schemes that come to us for implementation or trial or whatever you would like to call it. I think there ought to be a better process of their introduction, so we know at an earlier age where it is going. I mean, SRS is bandied about, and I don't know how good or how bad that was at the end of the day. But the fact of the matter is, I think looking at where we want to earn funds, I think we have to have better scrutiny and better briefing so that we make better decisions there. I don't think just going for innovation, I know these aren't quite the right words, but I hope you'll know what I mean, just for the sake of innovation, you know, me sir please, because I feel I should be doing it. You should only feel that you should be doing it if you're really, really convinced, and you're sure you convince somebody else, can convince somebody else that the scheme is a worthwhile one. So that is the point I would like. And the other thing is going off on a little bit of a tangent, which is unusual for me, but that is where we gain our knowledge from. And in the last council, the council before that, I was deputed to go to the Association of County Council meetings up in London, which were excellent. And you meet with other councillors from outside the principality, if you like, and you get more of a feeling of where they are and what they're trying to do. And of course, there's more of them in terms of rural councils than there are in South Wales that we could possibly learn from. And so I would think that we should re-establish that link with the Association of Convenience Stores, because we don't have it any longer. And I think that is unwise. That is just, it seems to me, us living in our silo again. If it isn't in Wales, you know, it doesn't concern us. That is absolutely wrong. We need to know what is happening everywhere. So I'd like to put that forward as a suggestion as well.
Thank you. Can I bring the Deputy Chief Exec in first and then...
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll hand over to Peter, because I think some of this is relevant to the establishment of a commercial strategy. But just to say, Councillor Dovey, on your point about closer scrutiny. I think that's definitely something that we would welcome. And Councillor Feakins and Davis came along last week the week before last, in fact, to a session we ran with some of our legal advisors on proper due diligence, what it constitutes, the kind of training that we need to invest in, some of the linkages to new procurement processes, some of the state aid implications. So I think in order to have that process of proper scrutiny, it's great for officers to be trained, but members need to have exposure to some of that thinking. So that's definitely something that we want to try and roll out much more widely, especially through the work that we're doing on procurement. And I agree, in terms of new innovations, it's really, really important that we have that enhanced level of scrutiny. But we mustn't forget the scrutiny being applied to some of the bread and butter stuff. I just had a press release from the Wales Audit Office into their review of the National Procurement Service. And it says, despite nearly £250 million being ploughed into that annually by local authorities, the level of savings back is negligible. They're not even repaying their Investor Save loan on procurement. So as well as applying, innovation to new things, new and better ways of doing things, some of the bread and butter stuff still needs an eye on as well. Pete, I don't know if you want to pick up on the commercial strategy and approach.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think it's just a few things in response, really. I just try and bring this together coherently. So, first off, if I just reflect on a couple of things, just in terms of, in terms of some of the senior management reshaping that's gone on in the last couple of years, and I guess if I just reflect on my portfolio and my brief, which looks to bring together the commercial aspect that you refer to, together with finance, and all under one umbrella, and the need to have that working together as one. But equally, just the point around future Monmouthshire, really. I mean, future Monmouthshire isn't something that's just out in the corner of an organisation somewhere. Future Monmouthshire to work, it's all embracing. It is the whole organisation, and I guess Mark, myself, other colleagues, work very closely with Kelly, the small team that represents, I guess, the hub of future Monmouthshire. But that whole redesign piece, end to end in the business, that's a collective effort. So the point around innovation for innovation's sake, you can easily trip into that. I accept that. But through No. But I understand what you're saying. But clearly, this is about understanding the problems that we are trying to solve as an organisation. That's multifaceted. We've got a whole multiplicity of different services, and service offerings that we're looking to deliver. We've had an earlier conversation around the affordability challenge. Councillor Breakbler referred equally to the increasing demand on services. So that produces a perfect storm and a conundrum, and very much what future Monmouthshire and what I guess the wider leadership cadre is looking to overcome, and in conjunction with members. Now, in terms of the scrutiny piece, and I don't want to repeat, I guess what Callie's just referred to, but if I just reflect on the new cabinet report format that's just gone out, that has now strengthened aspects around options appraisal. So coming back to your point in terms of process, strengthened around options appraisal, around evaluation, and some of these decisions being brought back in to understand as to have we been successful? Is there a need to actually close things down or to adjust them? But equally in terms of consultation and through scrutiny, and making sure that in the reports that is being made clear in terms of how scrutiny has fulfilled its function in terms of challenging some of the decisions that are being brought through. So So I think hopefully, I guess in its entirety, that gives you some comfort in terms of some of the process that we're looking to run through. I think specifically on the commercial piece, and as Callie's referred to, I'll be looking to bring together. We're in the throes of bringing together a commercial strategy at the moment, which I've made a commitment to the Chief Executive that I will look to have together in draft for internal purposes by Christmas. And then in the new year, I will be looking to bring that through. And again, I would expect Economy and Development Select Committee to be looking that over as part of their scrutiny function. In a way, that commercial strategy covers a number of bases. One aspect is around the commercial mindset within the organisation and how we can actually develop that over time. One is around some of the trading and commercial potential that we've got around some of our service offerings. And some of it's actually in terms of around our assets assets that we either hold at the moment or assets that maybe we wish to acquire for commercial purpose and gain. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight of what's to come, I guess, and in the new year.
Thank you, Chair. That's
Okay.
very good.
Mark, did you want to add to that?
I was just going to give a reflection that I think we're at something of a crossroads as a council. I think we've, for the last couple of years, become increasingly cost effective, and cost effectiveness and commercialism aren't necessarily the same things. We don't, in being a public sector organisation, we don't inherently have the skills associated with being commercial. I think members will increasingly it become a strand of their budget setting because the cost effectiveness aspect has largely been exhausted. And actually a lot of members, certainly some of the new members, have quite a lot of commercial acumen that they might want to bring to the table on that score. So when you talk about it being potentially doom and gloom, there are always silver linings to clouds here. There's a potential for doing things differently and excitingly. But if anyone tells you that they want to act commercially, I would always encourage members to challenge that and ask how. I do look enviously at some of the private sector practices. I allow their ability to pilot things, test it out, absorb it if it's useful, and remove it if it's not. I think inherently the public sector has some constraints around that in terms of the rules of the game and the expectations. That means that it's not as fleet as foot as private sector. But I do appreciate that actually some of these commercial opportunities will allow it to better sustain its core and traditional businesses. And so I hope this year, I mean, last year it was interesting that some of the debate around the budget setting was, should we be doing some of these innovative commercial things? That's not really our business. Actually, what I would encourage you to be open-minded to some of this stuff, but actually thoroughly test these things out so that you're actually going into it with your eyes open and understanding what your intent to get out of it.
Councillor Murphy, do you want to finish this point?
Just to add a little bit to that, because of the constraints that Mark referred to, that's why we look at forming wholly owned companies, doing things outside. It's the way you've got to go, because if you try and do it within the rules, you'll end up not doing anything.
Okay. Councillor Becker?
Thanks, Chair. We've certainly got a lot of desire to innovate. Just picking up on one of the relatively smaller numbers and pressures in the report about the Whole Place and Community Development Partnership, where we have this 65k sort of shortfall in the savings achieved. What concerns me about it is more that we were trying to restructure in a way to deal with the disconnect between the PSB and that team. And I'm just hoping that this isn't the side of a sort of seed of an issue where it's great for us to want to innovate and to restructure and try and make these savings, but when we actually hit the friction points against these other bodies, are we finding actually a lot harder to implement innovation than we thought? Is that why we've hit that sort of shortfall, essentially? So.
I'll kick off, Councillor Becker, because this does come under Kath's area, and I know she has something to contribute in terms of a direct line management of the team. But I think as a general principle this year, when I went back to my staff and said, look, it's a 5 or 10% cut, how are you going to do it? All I had back was staff cuts. And I just said, no, this is madness. You know, we've done a bit of that for the past 7 years. We've done lots of income generation, not just in the new innovative stuff, but in the day-to-day bread and butter stuff. The services in my area do turn over quite a lot of income, which is a staple for this council. But we got to the point where if we cut back on staff any further, those staff which are real assets to us, which could go out and optimise and convert opportunities into benefits for the county, they wouldn't be there. And as you know, when you cut something once, it's gone. You can't replace it. You can't get it back. So what we've opted to do across the board really with staff cuts is to say, right, we're going to stop this. You know, slimming and trimming is quite a reductionist way, I think, of going about planning a budget. But what we must do is set some of those staff and some of those assets that we have in our organisations broader targets. So, for example, if your post is there, it's still funded, you're expected to contribute some ideas and thinking to how we can solve the rural transport issue, to how we can become more efficient at procurement, to how if we have a specialist marketing approach in children's services, for every foster carer we secure in-house, we could save up to about £30,000. So we're trying to apply the resource that we've got to solving bigger problems, which I think will allow us to unlock bigger opportunities. So as regards staff cuts, you will see that we've put quite a firm foot down and said, actually, this could be counterproductive. We've got to look at a different way of doing this. And I think, Kath, that's exactly the same story with your service area, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of the community and partnership development team, it's very early days. The restructure has just went through in September. However, they are gelling very quickly because they have previously in the past worked in very similar areas. I'd say where we are now, though, is far more targeted in our approach going forward. So we'll have one specific officer in each of the areas. So everyone will have a specific point of contact that they'll know who to go to. But we're taking the learning from the previous area service officers and ensuring that they also have a strategic role and also a leading in terms of specialisms, whether it's sort of access for all well-being or whether it's for young people in enterprise. They'll look at that, but also taking on then a partnerships element too, so they'll be far more rounded in their approach. We'll also have a much better understanding in what's going on in the areas and can align with the area cluster work and the town and community councils, and I think we're already seeing that happening now. So I see it as being very much a positive. They're also very aligned with our youth enterprise team, our economic development team, the funding streams we have within the rural development programme and wider initiatives, which I'll talk to you a little bit about later. So although it's early days, I do think it's going to have a massive impact externally for members, but also internally as well, and how we become more efficient in our community engagement activities and development.
Yep, just come back on that.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to say something very unpopular. It's not really the number that bothers me. It's are you happy that when you do complete that restructuring, we are going to address that sort of disconnect between the PSB and the team, and it is going to serve the purpose that we set out to solve initially, as well as the money? So.
Yes, I am very happy.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, Mark, on this point?
I'm probably going to volunteer quite a complicated aspect here. On the one hand, from an accountant's point of view, in terms of putting these savings proposals to you last year, there would have been a pro forma and understanding this was the way that we were wanted to do things. And I think in the main that we ought to have the discipline to do them. But I don't necessarily think we should be slavish in doing them if we actually reflect upon that and think there's a different or a better way to do it. So actually the putting of the pressure back into the budget reflects the fact that actually there is a different way to do it. You're given the consideration as to whether that's a way that you wish to approach it going forward in light of the conversations you've had. And it will be all part of the budget setting that you decide upon in February as to whether you can afford that, because all these decisions have consequences and there are choices to be had. You can do an awful lot with 145 net budget, but you probably can't do everything. So it is increasingly an element of choice, priorities and aspirations for you as councillors.
Before I go over to Councillor Davis, just on this point, there is resource, there is goodwill in the whole, in the town and community council sector. I think we need to demonstrate as a council that we're positively engaging with them in collaborative agenda, that we can share risks, share rewards, and particularly if they're in our estates review, if there are any of our assets that may be used for community asset transfer, then may be able to strengthen our community capital, that we need to look at that as well. Councillor Davis.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Innovation is great, but we also need to look very closely at our own operations, and I think the procurement is an example of that, which is not about innovation, it's about doing perhaps what we ought to have been doing anyway, which is looking very closely at how much we actually spend. And, you know, if we were to save 2.5% on our current budget, that is £2.25 million. Not the best mathematician in the world, but I think it's £2.25 million, which is £2.25 million that we could be spending on those things which are our priorities and maybe some other things. And also in relation to the staff, and I've made this point to Kelly very often, that the best resource and the biggest resource we got are those people that work within this operation. And what we need to do is free up, you know, some of those people from the more mundane tasks to allow them to, as Kelly says, look at how are you going to improve this, because there will be some very good ideas there, I think. So I think we need to keep constantly looking at our own operation. I think there are some difficulties and there have been some concerns and mistakes made on some of the innovations we've tried. But don't get the idea that private industry doesn't make mistakes also, because they also make plenty of them, and personally I've made quite a few myself. But I think you're in a different situation here, because, you know, every mistake you make is scrutinised, you know, a lot by particular people, and I think it's more difficult. So I think what needs to happen now is those lessons need to be learnt from what we've tried so far. I think the business advice side is something that you need to look at. There are people here that, you know, I think can help with that, and maybe we've got to look at doing things slightly differently than we're doing them now, and the way we account for those units that we are trying to turn into profit-making units. But nothing, in my opinion, that can't be done. But it is a difficult task, and I don't think the council on its own can do it. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Councillor Figgins.
Thank you, Chair. It's a question for Mark. The council tax, we've got a proposal to put up the council tax by 4.95%, which is very insignificant compared to Pembrokeshire's 12.5% proposal. And when you've got inflation running at 3% or close to 3%. But nevertheless, that does cause some people in certain circumstances possible difficulties, in as much as they've got to pay, you know, more money to do that, obviously. Is there any way we can spread that payment over 12 months as opposed to 10 payments, and that would net out probably the monthly payment would equate to the same, if not a little bit less than what it is at the moment? Would that have any significant impact on the balance sheet? Significant impact.
Probably not significant. Why I'm pausing is that I'm of the belief that we already offer instalments over and above what we're statutorily required to do, and I thought that it was 12 months, but actually there's a colleague of mine that's more expert in that fashion, so if I can just check that out and come back to you separately. I believe that flexibility is already in existence. What I would also say that in modelling the increase of 4.95%, we also model a net cost to us in terms of council tax reduction schemes. So actually we model the same protection, and those individuals that are already deriving it or would fall into that protection would still derive a protection into the future.
Councillor Murphy.
Yeah, just add a bit to that, Chair. Our bit is 4.95, but if you cast your mind back to Mark's preamble where he said some of the precepts and levies aren't known. We don't know what the police precept is going to be. We don't know. We put it up 3.95 last time, but overall it was about 4.3, wasn't it? But that wasn't us. It was town and community councils. They put their precepts up substantially last year, and may do it again as more and more of them decide to do things for themselves. I'm sure I am right in thinking that where people have asked to go on 12 monthly payments, they've been allowed to. It's just that being selfish, the more money we can get in, the quicker we can get it, the more we can internally borrow and save ourselves support costs for external borrowing.
While we're on this point, and as Councillor Figgins pointed out, that some of the discussions are going on in West Wales, and some of the criticism that the council had last year for not going towards the 5% ceiling. What's the rationale for 4.9%, 4.95% this year in terms of modelling, and then potentially going down to 3.95%?
Well, we always keep the options open, and we will always respond to the pressures then. we've only announced an intention to model for 4.95 this time because of the pressures on us this time. Ask me the same question in 12 months' time and I might be giving you an entirely different answer. So at the moment, as Mark said, the model is for 4.95 this time and 3.95, but that's only modelling assumptions, only gives us an indication as to the pressures that are coming on us. We can't always rely on officers finding solutions to financial problems. Sometimes members have to give something back, and the general population needs to come up with a bit more, regrettably, but that's the way it is. And the extra 1% will give us around, well, net of council tax spend, about 450-ish. You know, it isn't an awful lot, but when you're down to trying to find the last bit of a budget gap, that 1% can make an incredible difference and mean that instead of cutting a service, you can maintain it. So we only use council tax as a strategy to make sure that we can continue with something. As far as I'm concerned, it's the only way of going about it.
Okay, Councillor Blakeborough.
A lot of the questions around that, the council tax being answered. I just wonder where we'd be if for the last 5 years we had set it at 4.95% instead of messing around with this 1% here and there, because I think it could have saved a lot of our services. I think, not being political, but here we are, I think it is a Conservative mantra for us, and you'll get reduced council tax. But so that, you know, as I say, there is kind of pressures elsewhere. Also, what tends to happen, they turn to the town and community council and say, can you put up your level of money so that we've got more money flowing? But it's not us, it's not the council, it's coming from town. So I think we've got to be open and honest about this when sort of setting these sort of taxes. Again, really just sort of echoing Councillor Davies and Councillor Duffy's concerns about investing money to generate money. I think when you look at our track record, it's patchy. And we do need robust business plans when we're investing or risking public money to try and generate money. And if we are going down that route, then absolutely we need robust scrutiny there. When you're looking at savings, it does tend to be staffing. I think that's where the savings kind of come from. I know that we're going down the route of sort of engaging staff as a general culture within the organisation, but I just wondered if you have any sort of insights on the morale of the staff at the moment, and staff sickness and high staff turnover does tend to waste money, it does cost money, and I just wondered if you had any sort of insight or even sort of figures on staff sickness and staff turnover.
If Councillor Murphy can address the first point on council tax, and then I'll hand over to
thank
Chief
you,
Officer
Chair.
for Resources.
I know the other information is available. Whether it's readily to hand, I don't know. But on the council tax, the point about towns and town and community councils raising additional monies to protect services that we are having to curtail, and I would dispute the fact that we've taken any services away. We're delivering them in a different way, and we might not do as many grass cuts as we used to, but we're still cutting the grass. You know, people love to say that we've cut services. We haven't got rid of any service, unlike an awful lot of other authorities. But the point is that town and community councils are not capped, and we are. And immediately Pembrokeshire started talking about 12%. Immediately the capping at 5%. Nobody's done it, but it's always threatened. So why do we not go over 5%? Because first of all, we don't want to burden our council taxpayers with more than we need to. If we can find other ways of doing it, we will.
Okay. Can I go to the Chief Officer for Resources for that second point? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just I guess a brief response, really. Point very well made. Obviously, the well-being of our staff is of fundamental and huge importance. Point made earlier, just in terms of, you know, our people are our most valuable asset, and they are. Suffice to say, I guess the challenges and the increasing challenges that we have faced and are facing, clearly that, you know, we've got to be very careful in terms of erosion of goodwill, you know, in the workforce. And going back to comments that have been made in the chamber over the last hour or so, really, just understanding, I guess, the pressures put upon people, the need to have a duty of care to our people as well. So we ran a staff survey a few months ago. That didn't, on the face of it, interestingly, and I'll explain why now in a second. Interestingly, it didn't raise any real and palatable concerns in terms of well-being of staff. However, I guess some of our other data, some of our other insight is highlighting, I guess, not concern necessarily, but I think when we look at the sickness absence data, really good that some of the work that's been done specifically around that over the last 12 to 18 months, because we had seen rises, and you will be aware of that in our sickness absence. So we have done specific work around that in terms of building better data and dashboards for our managers to keep on top of sickness. And that's been made available and that's in place. And more targeted work by, I guess, HR and I guess our OD, the OD side of our business as well. So it's good to see, I guess, in the Q2 sickness absence information that's going to work its way through Select and up through and in front of Cabinet, etc. In the coming weeks. It's good to see that our sickness absence or the projections are showing us to be have an improvement in last year. The issue I've still got is with regards to the percentage that relates to staff that are off for stress and psychological reasons, which is on the incline. Now that in itself is, you know, clearly highlights, I guess, part of the issue that we're trying to grapple with as an organisation. So it was only off the back of a conversation I was having with a leader, and in fact Phil earlier in the week, where you know, the leader re-emphasised and highlighted the very point about you know, from his perspective, you know, it was at the top of it, one of the things that was at the top of his list in terms of the health and well-being of staff. We've just recently run well-being events around the county. You may or may not be aware of those. Yeah, and we've had some really good turnout for those. I know Kelly has been at some of those and been able to sort of capture some of that live feedback from staff. Good open conversations really from staff, and we're just in the process now of actually bringing all of that together, that feedback and understanding in terms of as to whether our focus is on the right things within the business, and clearly we will look to adjust, as we always do, based on the feedback, our insight and our data capture, and make sure that I guess we're directing our limited resource in the right places for the benefit of our staff.
Okay, Councillor Devi.
Just one at the start of this discussion, I wrote down here when we were talking about the vacancy factor, I wrote in here loss of staff in key areas. Is this an area for concern? I think I do worry about that. I know employment is a free market, etc. But I worry about the fact that we are so thin on the very best people in our key positions. I'm worried that there will be a drain on this council if we believe what we believe is true, that we have among the best officers. And with the city deal, there will be a demand for officers from in our council. if they believe they are the best. We've got a key officer, as far as I'm concerned, in transport already, who is down in the Palace of Varieties for 3 days a week, which is a concern to me, because transport in the southeast of the county and what is going on with it at the moment is really, really key. So he is working all sorts of hours to try and wear two hats, and it's very, very, very difficult. And I will never ever be one to stand in the path of anybody trying to improve their career. But by the same token, I think we really do have to use our best skills to try and keep the best people that we have. And that very often is not just about paying money. So I'm not saying we aren't doing that. I'm not saying that. But just in case we aren't doing it perhaps as well as we might do to keep our best people, you guys, you know, I would like to have the assurance that we are doing that, because one person for us can be a bigger hit than 2, 3 or 4 people from another council. That's a concern I do have. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. I know a lot of the personnel issues are going to be dealt with in stronger communities. I know that's probably the best forum for that, but I'm deeply aware of your concern, and you're right to raise it. Yeah, you're absolutely right to raise it. Yeah. Just before I've got one more question, I think, and then I think we'll have to end this particular item. In terms of 3.27 on the report, other potential pressures that have not been yet factored in. Mark, you've obviously said that, those capital pressures, 21st century schools. I don't know, are there any other pressures that you can potentially that you haven't mentioned, you haven't factored it, and particularly in enterprise? And are there any pressures that you're sort of looking at and modelling at the moment?
As a council, we're reliant quite heavily on grants, as I've explained, and there are a number of grants that were still unknown. A couple of significant reports coming to the councillors through this next couple of cycles, which have financial consequences to them, that haven't automatically been modelled in the MTFP, because it would be conceited to presume the result of that debate. So the budget process is an intuitive one that runs from October to February until you consider the ultimate budget. Things will change. That's probably the only immutable aspect about the budget this year, is that things will change, and obviously if it's not being brought to your attention as part of the budget process, you will nevertheless get the opportunity to consider that as a separate and bespoke report.
Okay. I think we've given this report quite a good airing. The recommendation to us is to consider and to provide feedback upon the budget assumptions, pressures and saving performers affecting the selected portfolio area. Obviously conscious that we're also working with senior officers in relation to procurement, and we're adding value to that discussion as well. Are you happy that we've given this report and a good airing, and we've covered those points in the recommendations? Yep. Okay. Can I thank those senior officers who've presented, and can I thank Councillor Murphy as well for being here for this particular item. Before we carry on to our next item, can I suggest we have just a 5-minute comfort break? Okay. Thank you. Okay, I think we're all back. Okay, then if we move on to agenda item 6, which is draft capital budget proposals. We've touched on some of that in the previous item, and you'll be aware that a lot of those proposals are not within the remit really of this committee, but it's certainly an awareness exercise, and maybe a few questions that do come out. But if I hand over to Mark just to give a brief narrative, and then we can carry on. Thank you.
You must be getting tired of my voice this morning. I do apologise. I think we can probably make up speed in relation to this item, that actually it's provided to you in the context of the wider capital programme, because as the Chair suggests, that you have 5 schemes in this financial year that are all likely to expire, and the main premise that the capital programme is built on next year is a steady state approach. So there aren't actually any new schemes within the economy and development portfolio that we're volunteering into the pot, but recognising that it is Council that sets the capital programme annually, that you are likely to have a personal view, priorities, aspirations that you may wish to volunteer into that conversation in February. What I would just remind you is the 2 conditions around the capital programme is that for anything new to be added into the capital programme, it either needs to pay for itself demonstrably by way of a business case, i.e. afford its borrowing costs, etc., or derive external funding that means that it's not a net liability to the council, or it potentially replaces something already in the capital programme as a priority. So if you have any aspirations to put anything new in or supplement anything, then please understand that it will probably be more helpful. I'm being spied on here. That if you're wishing to supplement any budgets or add anything to it, it would be quite helpful for other members' consideration to know what you would prefer not to do or do less of, if that's at all helpful. And probably without over-egging the pudding, probably take any questions at that point you might have, so that you can we can catch up with your agenda.
Thanks, Mark. Questions then? Nothing burning? Councillor Murphy?
If I could just make a point, I know I'm reiterating something that was said in the last report, but it's wrong to say that members shouldn't worry too much about this report. But having put it like that, there is far more opportunity of looking at items with regard to the capital programme than it is for the revenue, because that's only done once a year. The capital programme comes to members every time there's an amendment to it. So we get lots of bites at the cherry on the capital programme. And as Mark said earlier, the only change to this report is the inclusion of the 300,000 for disabled facility grants, putting it back to the level that we put it last year. It's fixed at the moment at 600,000, so that will put it up to 900. We did an awful lot with that extra 300,000 last year. We can do an awful lot more with the extra 300,000 that's being put forward this time. Other than that, the main pressures remain. The one that's being added on, which will be put in the programme subsequently when we know more about it, is King Henry. So other than that, I think the report is pretty self-explanatory.
Thank you for that clarification. Thank you. Any questions? No. Councillor Roden? So can you just put your microphone on? Sorry, thank you.
Died.
Could I just clarify, in what particular respects? I mean, interest rates or borrowing, or Welsh Government provide us with an element of core capital funding that we can choose to spend on within our schemes, and that's £2 million. I'm not aware that there is that comes from Brussels and is under any sort of particular threat. The other significant element of our capital programme is the 50% funding that comes from Welsh Government in relation to our future schools aspirations. We've had a number of conversations with Welsh Government around Tranche B that Councillor Murphy alluded to. None of those conversations suggested that Tranche B isn't a reality, and actually the consultation process is ploughing forward at quite a pace within Welsh Government in actually considering what they should do and what lessons they needed to have learnt from Tranche A. RDP, we're not a big, we don't derive significant amounts of RDP funding, and actually our core capital programme is predominantly afforded by our own capital receipts and borrowing, and obviously the borrowing aspect is volunteered to you through the revenue account and its affordability and sustainability going forward. So I think if I could accurately predict the outcome of Brexit, I probably wouldn't be working for Monmouthshire County Council. But if I can reassure you that actually I don't see there being a significant volatility to our capital programme as a consequence of it.
I've got just a question on City Deal. There's obviously some constitutional governance issues that are currently being thrashed out. Just what are the potential implications of our contributions? Is there going to be any scenarios being looked at the minute that, in terms of mitigation? Just be interested in just a few points on that, if I could.
I mean, you are right. There are some dotting of the I's, crossing the T's in terms of that 10 authority model and engagement, and that's not due to crystallise in January time. It does cause a risk from our financial planning point of view, but we work with a degree of going concern aspect to it and actually look at the reassurances that we've had through the process. If those 10 authorities subscribe to the City Deal as we anticipate, the contributions that we are looking to make are as described in 3.5. There is always a potential at the 11th hour that those 10 authorities become 9 authorities, and that may very well impact upon individual authorities' contributions to City Deal. I don't think it's likely that the City Deal won't occur, but I acknowledge that actually one or two of the figures may very well change. But this is based on the best information that we've got to hand, and obviously if that changes before February, I will be giving you an update through the process about those changes.
Okay. Any further questions? Councillor Fegans?
Just a quick one for Mark. Do we hold any assets off balance sheet or anything through hypothecated finance or such instances which wouldn't be showing here necessarily?
The only ones I can immediately think of are perhaps some low-cost home ownership properties whereby we hold an equity share in them rather than necessarily a bricks and mortar consequence to our asset management aspect. We tend not to use complicated financial instruments and money market funds, etc. And even the considerations around the commercial strategy and property investment will probably be an on-balance sheet transaction rather than off-balance sheet, even though they're treated simplistically as finance assets going forward.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? No. Okay, so the recommendation is to consider and provide feedback upon the capital budget assumptions and priorities affecting the selected portfolio area. I think we've certainly done that on this item and the previous item. Are you happy that we've we've had enough information. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure we'll provide additional feedback through the additional sessions that will be coming between now and February. So thank you very much. Thank you, officers. You may. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is Crick Road, proposed disposal to Melin Homes, and I think Chief Officer Resources, you're going to take this, Pete? Or, yeah.
Yeah, I'm only going to do a very brief introduction because I guess, all the credit, I guess, needs to be given to Deb, who's on my left, who can introduce herself now in a second. But we wanted to make sure that we came back in front of Select Committee. There had been a report that had been previously brought through to obviously get consent to move forward with our arrangement working with Melin Homes. We are due to go up and in front of Cabinet now on the 6th of December. And clearly here today to allow the Select Committee to look over our intended proposals with regards to the partnership that we're looking to have in place with Melin Homes and to look to develop out the Crick Road site. I'm not gonna go into any level of detail because I think Deb will talk to that herself. But I'm very happy to come back in and respond to questions alongside Deb once Deb has been through the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm Deborah Hill-Howells, Head of Commercial and Integrated Landlord Services. Sorry, still trying to get used to the title. Some of you may or may not know that the Crick Road site is a local development plan strategic site. It was allocated a number of years ago. It's circa 27 acres. We own the majority of the site, and there is approximately 3.2 acres which is in third-party ownership. We've been liaising with those third-party owners throughout the duration of this process. Last year, we came forward to Cabinet to talk to and discuss with you about the opportunity of going forward in a partnership arrangement. Traditionally, we dispose of our assets on the open market so that we could demonstrate best price. It's a very transactional approach. Doesn't always lead to the best outcomes for our community because they'll go through the planning process, they will come forward with their own designs, and they will always come back in terms of viabilities on affordable housing. We wanted to do something different on this site, and we were approached by Melin Homes, who are the nominated registered social landlord for that site for the affordable housing, which is 25%. They approached the authority and said, can we do something different? Can we look at creating a partnership on this site? So for probably the last 18 months now, we've been working with Melin Homes as a team on an open book approach to see how we can maximise both the social and financial value that we can lever in while still being compliant with procurement legislation and our obligation to obtain best price through Section 123 of the Local Government Act. It's been quite a long process, but we are now at a position where we have a scheme. We've done that together. We prepared a brief that said we wanted the scheme to be based on dementia-friendly principles, and we also wanted it to be based on Poundbury principles. And for those of you who don't know the Poundbury scheme, that's Prince Charles's scheme in Dorset, where they look at pepper potting affordable housing. They mix the nature of the housing, the density, and the tenure throughout, so that we don't have a have and have not situated in different aspects of the site. One of our overriding principles was actually to develop a community for the site to have regard to its local context and the community that's already there. Also the impact on the infrastructure and how we can be sensitive to that, at the same time recognising Monmouthshire needs additional homes. So we've come up with a scheme that's 284 units. 25% of those are affordable, 71 of those are bungalows, that in the event that Cabinet and Council subsequently approve the creation of new home, social care home, would be supported from that. We, as I said, own the majority of that site, but we will need to acquire 2.2 acres if Council goes forward with the care home. I know social services colleagues have already presented to adult care. That's a very exciting scheme from our perspective because we actually recognise the need to replace Severn View. this site would enable us to do that and actually embed the care provision within the centre of that community rather than situating it on the outskirts as an afterthought. What we've tried to do is embed that within the whole design principles on this site. We are not able to enforce obligations on our development partner on this site if we have gone through a standard transactional approach, or even in this case on a land sale approach, because that would then take us into a procurement contract and we would be subject to overdue regulations. We believe we have a partnership now with Mellin. They have a long-term relationship on that site because they will be responsible for the building out of the 25% affordable housing, and they'll also have to support that housing in the longer term. They have initiatives, things around employment clubs, digital skills, handyman schemes that will be available on that site post-completion. They will not be walking away, they will be here for the longer term. That's where we're looking to maximise the social value. In terms of the financial value, we will need to get an independent valuation undertaken to be able to demonstrate that the value that we are looking to derive from Mellin Homes is actually full market value. And to be clear, that has been the basis of the discussion all along. We are not looking to subsidise Mellin's occupation of this site. We're not looking to give them a competitive edge in the marketplace. So we have appointed independent valuers to look at that valuation and the terms that we have agreed. We ourselves, whilst we were agreeing those terms, took our own view of the marketplace. We understood what the market comparables were, and we're very comfortable that it represents market value at this moment in time. Obviously, when they look at the value, they will have regard to the 25% level of affordable that needs to go on that site as well. So we are now in a position where Mellin are prepared to invest their money. Their board have been kept in line with this all along as well. They will be making a board decision the same time as we go to Cabinet. It will continue to be an open book approach. We've done all the due diligence on the site now. That's what the last 12 months has afforded us the ability to do. There are significant abnormals on the site, in excess of 3 billion. We have built into the agreement that any savings on the abnormal development costs we will share in, same as we will be looking to share in any enhanced value as they build out through the site, known as an overage clause. We'll be looking to do that as well. So we believe we've covered all the bases. Working with an RSL has enabled us to be able to do that because they have a lower developer profit margin than our commercial PLC companies do. So that is the nature of the deal. I'm quite happy to take any more questions on this. Pete, if you wanted to...
Just wondering whether you want to mention planning maybe. I don't know in terms of where we're at.
Oh, sorry, in terms of planning, we have a scheme ready that we will be able to start the formal public consultation on if members are minded to grant consent for us to move forward into that approach with Mellin Homes. That, as you may know now, is a 28-day consultation process, and then we need to review the feedback that we have, and then we'll be in a position to submit to planning. Just so that you are aware, we did our own public consultation last year before we actually entered into negotiations with Mellin, so that we understood what the local community wanted, and that was what helped us to drive the brief that we actually gave Mellin Homes in terms of building out.
Okay, thanks, Deb. And can I offer my apologies because I was remiss not to welcome you after the break. So welcome and thank you, Councillor Blakeborough.
Thanks. Probably asking you 3 questions you've already answered in your presentation, but also in your benefits risk appraisal. But I just want to sort of really clarify or crystallise in my mind, because these were my main concerns. And it was around is Mellin Homes paying the market value for the land, because obviously capital receipts we are desperate for all these other projects we want to do. As I say, I think I've heard the answer, but it's just easier if I sort of break it down there. So it's is Mellin Homes paying market value for the land? Legally, where do we stand in selling public land without going out to market, without going out to tender? And has anyone else shown an interest, for example, MHA? And then you have got benefits in there, but what are the top 3 benefits for Monmouthshire residents of this arrangement?
Melin Homes, yes, they will be paying market value. As I've suggested, we've appointed external valuer. It can't be the district valuers because the Melin Homes have to do their own independent valuation as well. So we have a consultant who's already employed as our investment advisor, and they are undertaking that valuation for us. So yes, they will be paying market value. If they come back with a different figure, we will be going back to Melin to challenge them on that figure, but we're comfortable with the figure that we've got. The second one, in terms of legal, yes, we've had a lot of scrutiny over the legality of this process because we do not want to fall foul of Section 123 or procurement. We've actually brought in external advisors as well to provide us with that level of assurance so we can understand what the marketplace is doing in England as well as here, because we have different legislation, but also to make sure, as I say, we don't fall foul. We are comfortable that we will not breach any obligations. Section 123 requires us to obtain best price. It does not prescribe the method of obtaining that. Therefore, we do not need to go and test in the open market, but what we do need is that independent scrutiny of the deal that we have agreed, and that has been recently tested via case law. So our legal advisors are comfortable that that's where what we are proposing to do is the correct procedure, mitigates risks. Are there other people interested? Absolutely. The PLC companies are very interested on this site. There aren't that many development opportunities in Monmouthshire. They regard this as the Golden Valley. You will be aware of the changes in the marketplace following the announcement by Welsh Government of the Severn Bridge tolls. We've reflected that in the market price that we seek to agree with Melin Homes. What are the three issues on this site? One, we are obtaining market value. So we will be getting a capital receipt that will be ring-fenced to the 21st century schools in accordance with our council policy. Second, we've got a partner that is actually a long-term investment in our area. So they won't be walking away from the site once it's actually being completed. They'll stay here because they already have homes in the area. And I guess the third one is the fact that we've been able to create a design, as I said earlier, that is place-shaping, has regard to its community, and is not about necessarily building big boxes that maximise commercial value.
Okay, Councillor Davis.
Thank you, Chair. I must say I like the scheme because Councillor Murphy and I have just been having a conversation about house building, and I think there are issues about these commercial companies not wishing to build the right amount of affordable housing in order to make themselves commercial, and sometimes they don't want to build when we want them to build. So I think this is an excellent approach because we desperately need more housing within Monmouthshire, and perhaps this is an approach that you may be looking to expand on. The only other question that I would have is, you anticipate going to planning. When would you anticipate perhaps that the first spade would go in the ground? Because I drive past this site quite often, and I have done for many years now, and we always look over and say they're going to build houses there, but nothing, it seems to move forward. So I think in terms of this council's policy, this is an excellent approach and something that most people will welcome. It's about timescale now, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
So assuming we get consent on the 6th of December and that Melin Board also make their final decision in line with ours, we wouldn't want to go to public consultation just before Christmas. That wouldn't make sense. We will start that public consultation early in the new year. So I would anticipate we'll probably end up with a planning, hopefully planning permission by the late spring, early summer of next year. That will then give them the ability to tender the scheme. So in answer to your question, I would expect to see groundbreaking at the end of next year, at the latest.
Thank you. I'll hold you to that.
Councillor Devi.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's a cracking scheme. From the moment it was first discussed, I thought it was great. It was innovative, and we should be up for it. I think Melin is a really good partner. The thing that went through my mind was when we talked about it at the first time, was that Melin would not just build the houses there. There would be provision for a doctor's surgery or whatever you would call it, a health centre, something like that. Those key attributes that make a community if you like. Is that going to happen with the development? Would that be part of the planning proposal that comes forward to us? Because I remember them speaking about it, and that was the vision that they had, and in the last council, it was the vision that some of us as councillors had also.
The scheme as it's currently proposed does not include a doctor's surgery on it. The hub of the scheme will be the social services facility in the event, as I say, that members' permission is forthcoming. We're looking to create that as the heart of the community and build facilities in there that perhaps the community can benefit from as well. And as I said, they will also be providing the support necessary to keeping people in their own homes built on that site. They did look at things like doctor surgeries, but in terms of the viability of the scheme, if we want to maintain the 25% affordable housing, as well as ensuring that actually there is a need from the doctor surgeries, etc. At this moment in time, no, that's not included in the scheme.
Yes, Pete? Yep.
Just one further comment, really, just to highlight the matter around Seven View. So, as well as this report going to Cabinet on the 6th of December, on that same agenda will be a report around Seven View, which will be looking to secure a cabinet decision to allow Claire Marchant as Chief Officer and obviously senior colleagues to actually move forward to develop that scheme out and actually to bring back a full business case, which I would anticipate probably being in the late spring of next year.
Councillor Dovey?
What ideas have you got in mind for Seven View, which is part of my little empire?
When the business case does come forward, what you'll see is that social services are looking to understand what the residential land value would be on the Seven View site in the event that they relocated the care facility to Crick Road, so residential.
Okay, Councillor Feakins.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Deb. I think, from my point of view, I think it's a fantastic scheme, fantastic idea. We're here to scrutinise it, so I can play devil's advocate with you for a minute, just to sort of tease out some questions, so it's not personal at all. But the risk factor to me is that we're working with a single operator, Mellin, okay, and we know Mellin of old. They're here established. They're registered RSL. Who we've got a long-term relationship with. They're a not-for-profit organisation, but the homes themselves are going to be developed by Mellin's trading arm, not by Mellin. So one assumes they're going to be making a profit. They'd have to make a profit to be trading, which is fine and all well and good. And that they then will deliver the 25% of 71 units through to us as affordable units. So I see there's a bit of a risk there that we're working with a single person and maybe we're a little bit too involved. I'll just play this through for a second. So maybe we're a little bit too involved. Do we need to hold their hand? Do we need to hold anyone's hand? The benefit to us to selling the site at the front end is obviously we've got a capital receipt, immediately capital receipt, and we're not into any risks of the £3 million abnormal site costs, those sorts of risks coming into a profile of developing any site. And with every site, there's development risks, which have to be brought into the mix. The area of development is an area that we know has got significant uplift value, and so obviously the overage clause will come into play in that to a degree. If the development timeline was a 3-year development or 2-year time development, then you would expect to see some sort of overage clause that would affect that. If that's possible, but that might not be possible because you're working with a floating target basically in that scenario. So you'd almost want to. So that what I'm getting at, I suppose, there's some inbuilt risks. There's some inbuilt risks with us dealing with Mellin. Mellin are operating as a as an independent, with their trading arm as an independent company, so they're minimising their risk, they're having a profit out of it. So what it comes back down to me is that we could shape the design through planning policy, through the planning permission. We could get the planning permission and say, here is the site that we've got planning permission for, and then offer that to the market. And we could have 3 or 4 people bid for that, and that would give us a definitive a scheme of deliverable houses, deliverable units that everyone would be tied into. Melin could bid for that the same as everyone else. If the PLCs are hungry for that opportunity, bearing in mind of the Severn Bridge tolls coming off, then there's a good chance they would pay over for that, especially considering the site constraints, the South East Wales constraints for development sites of this size coming to the market, which are very rare at the moment, and we're halfway through an LDP process, so that the amount of deliverable sites coming forward in the next 5 to 6 years is going to be minimal. So a PLC could latch onto this and possibly pay more than Melin. But Melin, we're saying that Melin would be wanting to pay market rates in any event, which they'd have to because they've got to make a profit. But my appraisal at this stage would be to say that we could have the benefits of obtaining the right site through the correct planning permission. We could and we can develop that ourselves. I'm only putting this forward, I'm not saying this is a suggestion, but we wouldn't then have to be hand-tied to Melin to walk through that process. The risk of being hand-tied walking through with Melin through that process is that they will have a fixed amount of costs coming into it. They might not be as efficient as another house builder, and yes, we're still getting the 25 houses, but they would bid for the 25 houses in any event. The 25%, not the 25 houses. So that's the few risks I'll put into the market. In my mind, that's sort of come into the equation. So I don't know if you want to how to sort of cover them off if you could.
Okay, you're quite right. We are working with one developer. Their trading arm is actually delivering a number of sites, so they have developed that expertise. They've also started to develop their own supply chain network, which has enabled them to build in some quantum and reduce the construction costs, which I think was a risk for us up front, because you're quite right, PLC would be able to have potentially lower construction costs than they would have done. They have employed people that are actually previously worked for the PLCs. They now have the same level of acumen and development skills that PLCs would have. We have sat on all of the development meetings to make sure that we are scrutinising and doing our due diligence in terms of the plans that are being prepared, simply because also in the event that we walked away from Melin, we wanted to have a set of plans that we were comfortable taking to the marketplace and delivered our aspirations. I think you will be aware, the same as other people involved in the property industry, that what tends to happen is that they will bid at a very high level. So yes, there is the potential that if we went to the marketplace, we would end up with a higher value potentially or initially. In our experience, what then tends to happen is as they do more due diligence, they do more ground investigation surveys, they start to look at the developer's profit. What tends to happen is they'll come back to the LPA with viability assessments, which reduces the low-cost home ownership and affordable housing on that site. We don't have any control of that, and that's something that we're trying to mitigate through this process, because for us there is parity in terms of the council policies around financial and social value that we're trying to derive. In terms of our arrangement with Melin Homes, our arrangement is directly with them, and we are looking at a risk and reward contract. So we will share the benefit of any uplift, because we are not looking to take the capital receipt in one payment at the acquisition point. We are looking to phase it throughout the scheme, so that as they develop their 50 houses per year or whatever it turns out to be, as that uplift is created through the sale of those houses, we will do another valuation at that point to make sure that at all times we are achieving the maximum value.
Can I come back on that? Yeah. Thank you for that. Just 2 points on that then is Melin perhaps don't have the scale as the other developers. We could mitigate that risk by wrapping it up into an SPV and selling an SPV to the market with established constraints. So we could mitigate that risk quite easily, and whoever was buying the SPV, for argument's sake, would then have to adhere to those constraints within the SPV. So that wouldn't be an issue. We could level that out. That wouldn't be an issue. Just another little risk factor comes into us then, or there's a cost risk factor comes in then, is that obviously if we're laying that piece of land open to the market or to Melin to say that you can have the site, no cash up front, then we also should be building in a cost scenario for that capital for us. So we've got a cost at the front end of 8% or whatever the cost of capital is, it's not 8%, but 4% or whatever the cost of borrowing is, then that needs to be equated back into the equation. But in essence, I'd want to be careful that we're not subsidising Mellin or subsidising ourselves, and that we're giving Mellin an unfair advantage in the marketplace away from PLCs, because we've got to be fair and honest with this, absolutely. And if Mellin think they want to have a go at it, then there are significant costs they need to bring into the equation, but also that we would have a good understanding of those costs for house builders, because on all the other sites they bring forward, like you said, they'll try and reduce their affordable housing contributions. So we would have a set of costs which would enable us at the front end of this process to go to Mellin and say, can you deliver these units at this cost? And I think that would give us the assurance then to say that Mellin would be the right person to be partnered up with.
I'm going to give a not a detailed response, because Deb will, but I think from my perspective, and having I guess been quite heavily involved in the scheme at the beginning, and then being able to step back and away and allow Deb to take charge of the project and work that through with colleagues. We had a discussion earlier around commercial, and I just want to make it clear that just in terms of the negotiations, the discussions that have taken us through to this point, and that will continue on and through, there is a very healthy commercial tension playing through this, and has done at all points. I wouldn't use the word fractious. There have been points, as is the case on all negotiations, where we've had to walk away and really scratch our heads, because the balance, I guess, of equitability seems to have tipped one way or t'other. But we've been able to come back and reconstruct the deal at each point to make sure that we're deriving the value that we should. And Mellin clearly needs to, and it does, as its trading arm and as an organisation, it equally needs to derive value. But bear in mind, as Deb described earlier, the inherent nature of Mellin is different to a house builder in terms of the ability for them to be able to suppress their profit margin. Their ordinary profit margin, I'm not going to make reference to it, but their ordinary profit margin sits below what an ordinary house builder would be expecting in the market, and we have been able to negotiate that down even further than they would ordinarily expect on a scheme. So I think we've arrived at a good point for ourselves and for them as well. So I just wanted to just make that point before I guess Deb sort of touches on anything further. And Deb, I think it would be useful, both in terms of responding to the supplementaries, but your original questions, just bringing an example on the table in terms of maybe a scheme quite close by where a house builder has come in and we have actually seen the consequence of that viability thing play through.
Okay, so the site that Peter is referencing, it wasn't one of our sites. It was actually a site that came to the market and was sold on the open market. It's the Sudbrook site. And that actually came forward in terms of viability, and as a result of their viability assessment, they reduced the affordable housing from 25% down to 9%. That is not something that we want to see replicated on our site, which is why we ended up in these discussions. I completely take your point in terms of construction costs from the PLCs being potentially lower than someone like a registered social landlord would be because of the quantum and the trade skills that they already occupy. We have been able to offset that because of the developers' profit margins that we are able to negotiate on this site because it is an RSL. So we have looked at all those conflicts, we have looked at all those challenges. There will be a payment at the point of exchange, so there will be some capital coming into that. And as our cost profile and all of our estimates, we've looked at what the cost of borrowing, etc., would be and what the cost implications to us are in doing that. But we genuinely believe we have now satisfied ourselves. We will wait and see now to see what our external valuers will say in terms of whether we actually have a commercial deal that is equivalent to what we would get in the open market. We will also have the test of our own site that is currently in the marketplace now at Rockfield Farm, which we are advertising on the basis of a traditional transactional approach. We are inviting offers. We have changed our scoring matrix, so instead of saying price, to look at a value to the authority to enable more innovative approaches to come forward on that as well. You may be aware that we're looking at things like modular build that will enable people to come forward on that basis. So even on a transactional approach, we're trying to broaden the scope for people to come back and offer us financial incentives to enter into that contract with us. But in terms of risk, there is always risk. In anything that we do, there is a commercial risk, whether we enter into a contract with a PLC or whether we enter in the contract with an RSL. What we need to do is understand those risks and manage those risks. And through the structure that we have created, where we have a board and a working group, I believe that we've done that and will continue to do so because we've got an open book approach and a long-term relationship with Mellon Homes.
Okay, Councillor Becker.
Thank you, Chair. Most of my concerns, Matt's already dealt with very ably, far more ably than I would have done, probably. The only thing that's sort of outstanding for me is maybe a bit of clarity on the sort of schedule of when we'll be getting capital receipts if we're not taking this one payment. It's good that we're reassessing it as we go along to maximise the value, but I'd like to know a bit more about that. From a personal point of view, I fully support the scheme. I think, especially in terms of dealing with the mechanism, which I see as very disingenuous on the part of profit-driven developers to put in high bids and then use the viability study to, price us out of having any of our social housing. I think it's an excellent way of dealing with that. But yeah, a little bit of clarity on how the money's coming in over time would be good.
So what we've agreed at the moment is that there'll be a 3-phase payment. The first payment will be at the point of exchange and completion on the contract. I am then leaving that to my colleague Mark Howcroft, has actually been sitting on the group with us, and we'll be looking at when we think it will be the best point to realise in terms of the uplift in values that are happening. So that's not fixed at the moment. The first payment is fixed. How we split the next two is part of the negotiation that's yet to be concluded as we look at the changes in the marketplace already.
Yeah, just one further point really, and it's sort of emphasised by the point that Deb's just made really, and the fact that I guess our senior finance colleagues in Mark have been working very closely with Deb, the rest of your team, to bring this to fruition. And naturally there'll be a tension, getting from a position maybe where we forecasted one lump receipt initially, and then the fact that it is now phased. But that conversation's worked it through in terms of some of our medium-term financial planning around our capital programme. So we just, we've been able to sort of sense check that one and make sure that we can accommodate it. The only other point to make really is, and I want to echo, I think, a point that Deb made a minute or two ago, which is around, I guess you describe it, and as you have done over the last sort of half an hour, the Crick Road scheme. You talked about Rockfield. We've talked about, I guess, Raglan and other schemes. And I think these will be schemes that will be brought in front of you in time. We're not going to see one size fits all, and we're not. The circumstances will be different every time. So when I refer to Councillor Feakin's point around a spin-out, quite possibly that may have to be a feature of some of our future developments and the nature of how we work, either in partnership with private sector, RSLs, etc. So, we talked about innovation earlier, and whether you stick an innovation stamp on this thing, but it is the authority trying to be creative to derive maximum value, and maybe not in the way that we have seen in the past, where maybe we've just sold land and just taken that receipt up front. And I think in what Deb's described, just on the Crick Road scheme, the wider benefits that are derived from a scheme such as this.
Okay. Councillor Devi.
I heard what Matt said, and he is absolutely right. But the benefits to us, I feel, is with this scheme, to start off, the design and community feel is breaking new ground. So it comes with a different view of what we are putting in place in Monmouthshire. And I think that's something important that we might lead on. The other thing is the finances in the main are, and the margins are satisfactory to us, not city-driven as they are with Bovis or whoever you like. Affordable units are not an issue with us. They're always an issue with If you sit on planning, you know full well we go through the whole thing, and then somewhere along the line they will say we can't afford to develop this site as it is. We've got to have less affordable units, you know. So this is a big plus for us to have to have that. They come, as far as construction is concerned, I've seen the work they do. They come to the construction of the sites, I think, with entirely different levels of values. They will have a longer distance view of the quality of the sites, the development of the sites, so they will have more longevity built into the future. And I think there's a good option for us here, with a bit of luck, to develop this further. I've always thought that would be a good idea. All of this is, of course, subject to the business plan and the risks, and that is what you are there for, Debs, isn't it? To make sure it's all on a fine footing. And I have no hesitation in saying I think this will be great for Monmouthshire, it will be great for the residents, and hopefully having a new kid on the block will make the other developers in private sector sharpen their pencil if they want to compete for sites within Monmouthshire. Yes, good.
Okay, Pete.
It's only a very quick input, really, just to, I think what you've done there is sort of exemplify not just what we're trying to achieve from Crick Road, but I guess in terms of our trajectory moving forward. So this is striking a balance. So rather than just singularly going in for an upfront commercial return in terms of the sale of the land, it is actually understanding, you know, we talked earlier around innovation, and I made the point in terms of understanding the problem or problems that you're trying to solve. So if affordable housing is an issue, if housing supply is an issue, in terms of our budgetary issues, in terms of being able to actually secure, better or longer term returns, then if we can play all of these things into one and actually derive a solution, which is what we're ultimately aiming to do, then that's good for a number of reasons and not just singularly for commercial reasons.
Thank you, Councillor Dovey. If you can just turn off your microphone for a minute. Thank you very much. In terms of some of the planning issues that we've discussed, I'm sure a number of those nuanced issues will be played out in the planning seminar this afternoon. So do feel free to raise those questions this afternoon with Mark Hand. So just to sum up, I think we welcome this approach. The approach have been taken, not a simple traditional transactional approach, but we've gone for an approach that will deliver best community outcomes, and that, not just in terms of affordability of housing, but also this fantastic dementia facility that will undoubtedly be looked on with envious eyes in other parts of Wales, and hopefully within the regional partnership board area. In the future we may have a further partnership with the health board. And in terms of pool budgets, it may be something, projects that we can work on in the future. So can I just thank Peter and Deb for your presentation and answering our questions. Thank you. Okay. So the next agenda item is item 8, presentation regarding the City Deal strategic investment proposal for Caldicot Town Centre. Given the scrutiny we gave item 5 this morning and the time pressures with the seminar this afternoon, I've discussed it with the scrutiny manager and taken a decision to defer this particular item to the a successive or subsequent committee session, and the presentation which Kath was going to give has been emailed out to you, so you can see that today, but we'll look at that in more detail in the new year, if that's okay with everyone. So if we move on then to agenda item 9, which is the performance report 2017-18, and hand over to you, Richard. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we're here to present an update in terms of some of our key performance indicators at the 6-month stage of 2017-18. Members will recall last time I was here, I presented our performance framework, which is how we translate our vision into action in the authority. An important part of which is performance data information to track the progress we made and evaluate our performance. Now, as part of this, there's a variety of indicators, both nationally set and locally set, we use to judge our performance. But the information I'm presenting you today is an important set, set by the Data Unit Wales. National performance indicators that are benchmarked annually to other councils. And Appendix 1 contains those indicators that are under your remit as Economy and Development Select Committee. Other indicators will be reported to the other relevant committees. As you can see in Appendix 1, the performance data there sets out the indicator, the trend data, so some past performance data for that particular indicator, the targets that have been set for this year, the performance at the 6-month stage, and that includes the calculations that have been used to produce the performance data, and then importantly then the benchmarking quartile, which is where we benchmarked compared to other authorities in 2016-17. So that's obviously not related to the progress so far in 2017-18. Members will be familiar with that information being presented in the improvement plan to council back in September. Some indicators are only reported 6 monthly, some are new, so data is not yet to be collated, and obviously that will come forward to you at the end of the year. This is a shorter report than we usually present. You will receive a variety of performance reports from services as part of your work programme directly, and also at the moment, whilst the authority is developing a corporate plan that will set some of the future direction and incorporate our wellbeing objectives, when that's in place, that will then set the framework for some of the corporate performance reporting we as a performance team will present to you in future. But at the moment we wanted to make sure you were cited on some of these key indicators as part of your work programme, obviously supplementing the range of information received directly from services throughout the year. So that's the background. There's only a few indicators on there. I'm happy to take any questions. If there's any specific points we can pick up with officers after the meeting as well.
Okay, thanks Richard. Any questions, observations? Councillor Baker.
Thanks. Just so that I'm sort of clear, when you're looking at performance, I mean, one of the areas that we look in our performance is the housing supply and affordable housing. Does that come under another remit? Because it's not on here. Is that under strong communities, is it?
I say this currently, it's under your remit, I think, affordable housing. In terms of the performance indicators, national performance indicator set I'm presenting here doesn't include any indicators on affordable housing, so we've only presented that set, which is why I'm saying some of the broader information you'll receive directly from services, and also when we look at perhaps the framework that will be developed under the corporate plan, in future I may be bringing you a broader range, but at the moment this is very specific just to that one indicator set, which is why it's not reflected.
Just two questions really. I guess there will be some questions you might not be able to answer because it's sort of data rather than kind of specific. But looking at the percentage of empty private properties, I guess I'm sort of interested in, you know, what are the reasons that they are empty, and what action are we taking practically in order to bring these properties back into use? So that's one question. The second, red, so number of visits to leisure centres. I'm just wondering, would you be able to let us know how that compares to other authorities and how we compare with Gloucestershire and Herefordshire? I'm also aware that running and cycling is on the increase when you're looking towards health and well-being of people in Monmouthshire, and that might have a negative impact, I guess, on leisure centres because they do that instead of going to leisure centres. So just something around that. I'd also be interested in knowing that the split between the 4 leisure centres, which are the strong ones, which are the weaker ones, what can we learn from those? And also I'm interested in the prices and how our prices compare with other authorities bordering on Monmouthshire.
Yes. Okay. So I can pick up some.
Yeah, I'm conscious some of the technical stuff, and you may have to refer back, Richard. Thank you.
Let's start off with the question around empty homes. This indicator relates to, there's a variety of guidance that's behind it, and this indicator relates to those empty homes brought back to use by direct action for the local authority. So those 27 are classed with as direct action, and the guidance sets a number of actions the council can take. One of which, and the main one in which we undertake, the housing team do to collate this data, is they send out letters to empty homeowners at the start of the year, and with formal advice and assistance in terms of what they can do to bring that property back into use. And the definition then allows for those who engage in conversation with us, for us to then classify that as being returned to use through our direct action. So for this indicator, that's the main ways in which we contact empty homeowners each year to classify indicators being classify properties being returned to use for our direct action. Obviously, they will be liaising with other colleagues, for example, in environmental health, etc., throughout the year on any opportunities to support bringing empty properties back to use. But in terms of the process for this indicator, that's the main communication that goes out. So in terms of leisure centres and the comparability of that indicator, the report sets out where we benchmarked in Wales last year, and it shows we're in the bottom quartile in terms of visitor numbers. And you're right when you say that when you talk about running and cycling. Obviously, this is only looking at visitor numbers we can capture on our 4 leisure centre sites. So obviously, but we're not discouraging people from being active in other ways. So when looking at this, how we compare to other authorities in England, this is set so we can benchmark ourselves with Wales. I'm not familiar with the English benchmarking approach, but there may be issues in terms of how we collate the stats to be directly comparable to English usage around leisure centres. Certainly, I know that they can break the visitor numbers down by sites, and that they look closely at their marketing material and their usage at the different sites and how competitive they are as well. But again, that's sort of the high level detail I can give you. The more detail will come from the leisure service themselves. But I don't know if that answers some of the questions, but not fully.
I think some of the housing, your housing questions, the adult selector looking at the homeless, the authority's homeless strategy in the new year. So you'd be very welcome to come to that meeting, Deb, if you're around. I'm sure Simon would welcome additional questions. 23rd of Jan. I'm sure he would welcome additional questions on that issue. I've got... Okay, Councillor Davis.
Thank you, Chair. I don't want to ask specific questions, even though I think I like the way these things are presented, because I like key performance indicators, because that does give the opportunity to ask questions. But one point I'd like to make on a personal basis is that I have tried to look at data comparing us with the other authorities on our online facilities, and generally speaking, they're not up to date. It's very difficult to get that information, and I think it's something that really needs to be looked at, because I've looked at that site a few times and it's just not kept up to date in terms of the figures that are being generated. And I think this sort of format for a councillor is excellent. It allows you to start to ask the questions, the nitty-gritty inside of these performance indicators, and I don't think at the moment we're getting the right amount of information on those key performance indicators that we should be getting, and I think that that's something perhaps that the authority needs to look at, and that website in particular needs looking at. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, thank you for that point, and appreciate the feedback in terms of presumably our website and display of this information. It's something we're keen to improve, and we're looking at opportunities for where we can surface more of this information automatically, and also how we can draw in and use technology to its maximum to present that. So, for example, things like open data feeds, how we can present data from other organisations, rather than needing us to manually update it, we can automatically update it when it's updated in other ways. I'm also conscious that not everyone will want to view information level of detail a councillor will as well. So how we meet both audiences, so we give people maybe a light to touch overview as well as then a more detailed overview. And something we're certainly looking at internally, which would be available to councillors as well, is improving our current data dashboards information. And I talked about the corporate plan framework being put in place. Alongside that, we'll set some clear criteria around measurement and evaluation. and that measurement evaluation will be then the basis of the redevelopment of those frameworks, which will obviously communicate out to councils as well. So I take the point. But in terms of national information in particular, there are a number of Welsh Local Government Association sites that hold the information as well as us. So happy to sort of signpost you to those and take you through some of those so you can access our information, and also importantly, as you say, our comparable information with other authorities as well. So happy to offer that opportunity.
Well, thank you for that. I'm glad to hear that you were aware of what the issues are. But from my perspective, I'd seen time to talk about timelines, because if this is an open-ended thing, you know, as a councillor, I want that information. So I appreciate you can't do it tomorrow, but I think we ought to have some indication of when we are going to have these things in a state that we can really look at them and interrogate them without having to go and ask other people about these things, because we can't see the information on the website. Thank you.
Appreciate that. And in terms of, I talked about the new developments, I think just probably worth reiterating some of the things that are in place which you can access now. Obviously our performance reports coming through to the various committees, but also our service planning level across the organisation. We've got 40 plus service plans from each service. Within that is a measurement scorecard that sets out their key performance indicators. Those are updated on a quarterly basis, including targets. So for you, certainly maybe not as a member of the public, but you as a councillor, you can access that, and I'll give you a more up-to-date picture now live as far as quarterly updates are. I appreciate, but we're hopefully working towards the more live information as part of our developments, where and how certain council services are performing and evaluating themselves. Might be helpful.
Thanks, Richard.
Can I just say that I'd be delighted if you'd point me in the right direction. Thank you.
Maybe it's something we can consider wider. If a few members are raising it, we're happy to maybe revisit some training or some awareness raising about that in future. So,
yeah, I think it'd be helpful. Yeah, thanks, Richard. Yeah. I've just got one question in terms, well, probably something to take back, I think, Richard, more than anything, in terms of our leisure centre offer. Just, it'd be good to understand how we're engaging with community primary care providers in terms of increasing or enhancing the drive for social prescribing. I'd be just be interested to understand some of that data and who we're engaging with. Any other questions on this item? No. Okay. Thanks, Richard. Thanks very much. Okay. So agenda item 10 is the list of actions arriving from the previous meeting. So you'll see the minute item 7, which was the members' workshop. Worked with a scrutiny manager and Bob O'Dwyer on this. I think the minutes were circulated of the discussion that happened earlier this week. I don't know if do you want to add anything to that, Hazel?
Yes, just to say that workshop has taken place. All members were invited. It's not minutes that we circulated, but some notes of the actions that we've agreed, and you'll probably recognise that it was a different style of working, something that we're trialling with you initially and other select committees in terms of workshops that are focused and interactive. I think members who attended really enjoyed the workshops and found them useful, and I think officers found them invaluable in terms of setting forward key actions that we're to take forward. So your roles as members in setting the actual strategy in which you want us to work, and ours then in taking forward the delivery. I think it was a really useful process, and that's the second of that type of workshop that we've put in place. The first was the Future Mon, and then the procurement. So we've sent the notes to you, and we've also sent through the report that Kelly referred to this morning on the value of the National Procurement Service, and that was one of the key themes that came through the workshop. So you've had that. In terms of your work programme going forward, the only things for you to be aware of really is that this afternoon you've got a seminar on the LDP, which is to be hosted by this committee and led by this committee, but Mark Hand is the officer that will take forward the discussion. So that's for all members, but hosted by this committee in terms of getting forward the views of the LDP, what should be considered in the next sort of round of review. The other thing to be aware of is we've sent through the presentation today that Kath Fallon was going to deliver, and we're going to put that, if you agree, on your meeting in January, because you've got the sale of the County Hall report on there and we just couldn't do it justice today. So if you're happy with that, Chair, that's the work programme.
Thank you very much. I'm just really apologetic that I couldn't be with you last week. I'm really pleased about the progress and value this committee's adding to the work streams of the council. I think it's certainly something that we'll report to Cabinet in the new year. Councillor Becker.
Just say it was a great workshop. Perhaps we could be thinking, rather than resting on our laurels, saying what a great workshop, about one for January as well, maybe looking at a more external factor like the partnerships, so that we can take into account how we would forge some of the partnerships that we came up with in the future Monmouthshire workshop, and also maybe even get a little bit of an update on the ADM. So,
okay.
Just for you to be aware that we've organised a special meeting of all of the select committees this side of Christmas to look at the ADM. We feel that's really important, and Nicola from Democratic Services will be emailing you probably today a date for that. So it'll be a joint meeting of all of the selects, and that should be, you know, just before Christmas. It could be that it's right near the week before, but you'll have an opportunity to discuss that. In terms of the partnerships, Jez, what sort of things would you like to discuss specifically?
Well, I think when we were looking at it in the future Monmouthshire workshop, we were saying that a lot of these deals, obviously the ADM covers a lot of it because it's about our commercial integration, but then there is also the cross-border partnerships and better ways of leveraging partnerships within the community. So it could dovetail very nicely into whatever happens when we get an update from the ADM. I mean, or it may be that actually makes it not so pertinent. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I'll let Hazel come back on that.
We did discuss in the pre-meeting that in the work programme there's a workshop set up for you to meet with sort of other councils, Bristol and so forth. That's been in the pipeline for a while. We haven't set a date because we feel that there's quite a lot of work to be done before you'd want to sit down with other partners in other councils, other councillors, to have sort of strategic discussions. And I think what led to this sparking off in the beginning was a feeling that some of the sort of cross-border services we're experiencing problems with in certain sort of areas that are actually technically in Monmouthshire and technically outside of Monmouthshire. And I think you need to have some discussions with members of the public and try and pin down what some of these issues are before we set up a meeting with other councillors to take that forward further. So I know that we've got plans to perhaps have some discussions with members of the public in certain areas, and I think we need to do that first. Yes, yeah.
Can I bring Kelly in on that before I go back to councillors?
Just to say, committee, that obviously you've had the notes now on the procurement workshop. I've looked over those notes, and there's a massive amount of work to be done. Even if we just took one strand of that and focused in, there is work for you to do as a committee. You know, there is knowledge that needs to be applied to this. We need to have follow through. So the next series, they won't be workshops so much as I think as, you know, actual sort of doing sessions where we can look at the data, we can understand the follow-up, and we can understand the actions that we need to mobilise as a result. So that will happen in January. I really liked what happened last time, which was the external speaker coming in, providing a stimulus and provocation, which I think gave the workshop a better flow. So I think we could probably replicate that again. The only thing I would say is that I think the work on procurement is really practical. You know, it needs doing power, roll up our sleeves, get stuck in with Pete and the team and really make a difference. The stuff that I think you're looking to do around cross-border, I don't think it will relate to the ADM, especially initially if we do have an ADM. as a new startup organisation, there's going to be lots of internal systems and processes they will need to prioritise, and I wouldn't advise them to do anything differently. They will be a startup, so that has to be the focus. I'd say the difference in terms of your focus on external partnerships is what you're looking to do there is less practical work and a more sort of strategic influencing. So I think you probably need to apply subtly different approaches to those two things. We have made contact previously with the guys who run Business West, which is a trade business organisation which covers the whole of the Southwest. They've got about 30,000 members. We've worked quite closely with them, and it might be they're quite key to actually coming in and brokering some of the conversations that we need to have. But again, I would urge focus. That can't be around any number of issues. It could be around transport, it could be around economic development, GVA, but I would urge you to try and pick one thing and to have that focus, because I think you'll be able to gauge the progress you make much more clearly if you're able to do that.
Thanks for that, Kelly. Councillor Blakeborough.
Just going back to the alternative delivery model, and you were saying that there will be a meeting where we can look at that. I'm just aware that it's on the Cabinet Planner for the 6th of December, the alternative delivery model. So, I mean, obviously it needs to come to us before it goes there.
Councillor Blakeborough, it's not. We've taken it off the Cabinet
you
Planner
have,
for the
right.
6th of December. It'll either be a special meeting this side of Christmas, which I don't think will happen now given the timescales we're working towards, so I would imagine that will come early in the new year. Yeah, Cabinet, and don't forget, it's a high-level policy decision, so it will have to go to Council as well, yeah.
Okay, Councillor Devi.
Just a quick one, Chairman, thank you. I couldn't attend the last meeting. I did phone in and apologise for that, so if I hope that is included on it. When are we likely to be able, because I'm really interested in this, when are we likely to be able to see the notes of that meeting, or minutes of that meeting?
Those notes have already been circulated, Councillor Devi, earlier this week. I think it was circulated, but Hazel will send it to you again now as we speak.
Well, all right. Am I covered in embarrassment? Yeah?
Never. Okay, I think in terms of then items 11 and 12, I think we've covered them both off in that discussion. So the next meeting will be Thursday, 25th of Jan. So thank you very much all for your contributions. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. I'm sure you'll come back refreshed. A few pounds heavier, perhaps.
Bigger.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Another sandwich, are there?